These are 30 true horror stories that happened during spring break, but they are not what you expect. So turn the lights off if you dare and listen closely, because not everyone who went on spring break ever came home. Crimson Sands. I still shudder when I remember that spring break, the one that began with promises of freedom, sun, and endless partying on the shores of South Florida, only to degenerate into a nightmare that would haunt me for decades. My name is Kyle, and I was just another college student, desperate for escape and adventure during a break that had been talked about for months. Our small group of friends had pooled our savings to rent a modest beach house on a secluded stretch of sand known locally as Crimson Sands, a name whispered in half-jest among spring breakers and local lifeguards alike. The name, we later discovered, was no exaggeration. When we first arrived, the house looked inviting enough, an old, weathered structure that creaked with the secrets of its past. Its faded blue paint and salt-crusted windows blended with the raw beauty of the shoreline. The ocean there was a shifting mosaic of turquoise and gray, and the beach was almost deserted in the early hours. We set up our tents, unloaded our coolers, and prepared for a long week of music, bonfires, and intoxicated adventures. Laughter and anticipation filled the air as we drove off to the nearest town for supplies and headed back, sun-drenched and eager. That first night, the party was everything we'd imagined. Music thumped from a battered stereo inside the house, while we danced on creaking floorboards beneath flickering string lights. The heat was stifling, and the ocean breeze provided only occasional relief. Our conversations were punctuated by ridiculous dares, alcohol-fueled confessions, and echoes of laughter. But amid the revelry, I couldn't help noticing an undercurrent of unease, a subtle shift in the atmosphere near the back of the property where the beach met a line of dark, twisted mangroves. A few of us joked about ghost stories and local legends, the tale of a vagrant spirit said to haunt these shores, doomed to wander in a state of endless sorrow. We laughed it off as campfire fodder, not suspecting that the true horror would soon make itself known. Late that night, after the party had dwindled and most of us were returning to sleep, I awoke to a distant sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the direction of the mangroves. At first, I assumed it was merely the wind playing tricks on my ears, but something compelled me to slip out of the house and walk toward the source. Moonlight cast fractured shadows along the beach, and the cool air was thick with the scent of brine and decaying vegetation. As I neared the edge of the mangroves, the tapping grew louder, punctuated now by irregular shuffling sounds. My heart pounding, I crept closer and found nothing but the silent, relentless lapping of the tide. I dismissed it as a remnant of my overactive imagination fueled by the ghost stories of earlier hours. Yet, the phrase "remember" drifted faintly on the wind in a way I couldn't quite place. The next morning, the reunion of our group was uncharacteristically subdued. There was talk of strange sounds, inexplicable silhouettes glimpsed by some near the tree line, and even a missing item, a pendant that belonged to one of our friends, Mia, which had disappeared from her jacket the night before. No one could offer a rational explanation, and the normal chatter of post-party chatter was replaced by anxious murmurs. We chalked it up to a drunken lapse and shrugged it off as an isolated oddity. But I felt that unease again, the sense that something terrible had brushed in for just an instant before vanishing, leaving behind only a whisper of its presence. Over the following days, while we attempted to salvage our holiday with the usual debauchery and sunlit excursions, there gradually emerged a series of disturbing events. On one afternoon during a beach outing, one of our friends, Brett, vanished without a trace. We had been exploring tide pools and joking about ghost stories along the water's edge when, after a few minutes of playing in the surf, Brett was no longer in sight. Panic set in as we combed the beach, calling out his name over the steady roar of the Atlantic. His disappearance was inexplicable. No footprints, no sign of struggle, only an unsettling silence where his laughter had once echoed. Eventually, the local authorities were alerted, but Brett was never found, and his disappearance became a grim stain on what was supposed to be a carefree vacation. That night, as storm clouds gathered ominously and the wind began to howl a dirge across Crimson Sands, The atmosphere grew oppressive. We huddled in the house, our faces drawn, our smiles long since faded, and listened to the relentless pounding of rain against the shutters. Late in the evening, I was jolted awake by a piercing scream outside. I bolted from my room and, heart hammering, rushed toward the door. In the near darkness of the hallway, I could just make out a silhouette, a figure draped in shadows, standing at the edge of the porch. I called out, but the sound was swallowed by the storm, and when I stepped outside, the figure had vanished, leaving behind only a scattering of wet footprints in the soft sand. The prints led not to the safety of the main road, but toward the mangroves where I had earlier encountered that indecipherable whisper. It was as though the night itself were guiding or warning we to confront a secret buried in those dark thickets. Unable to sleep and desperate for answers, I ventured alone the next morning to retrace my steps in the area where the footprints had been. What I found defied explanation. Near the base of a dead, twisted mangrove lay a series of crude symbols hastily etched in the wet sand. They resembled a chaotic script, a tangled mixture of spirals and jagged lines that I couldn't decipher, but which stirred a primal fear deep within me. In the center of the formation was a single word, scorched into the sand by the afternoon sun. Remember. The word burned on my mind as I hurried back to the house. I could hear echoes of it in the gentle rush of the surf, and even in the distant cry of a gull overhead. As the days wore on, a palpable dread settled over our group. We began sharing whispered accounts of eerie sightings, a woman in a torn dress wandering the shoreline at dusk, inexplicable shadows moving fast and low along the dunes, and the persistent sound of faint, barely audible voices chanting that very word. The vacation we'd envisioned, bright and unburdened, was rapidly morphing into a living horror story. At night, we dared not speak aloud in case the entity we felt lurking might be drawn to our voices. One evening, as the sky bled red during a violent sunset, I found myself unable to resist the lure of the unknown any longer. I gathered the courage to return, this time with two others, Jake, whose resolve had hardened over the past few days, and Sarah, whose eyes betrayed both desperation and determination, to the mangrove area. We crept along the water's edge, flashlights bobbing in our trembling hands. Every step was accompanied by the murmured chant of the wind, "Remember, remember." The undergrowth was thick and invasive, the tang of decay and salt mingling in the humid air. We reached the spot where the etchings had been, and I recalled the solitary word burnt into the sand. Without fully understanding why, I traced the word with my finger. In that moment, a deafening silence fell. The night, the wind, even the crashing of the distant surf paused, as if the world were holding its breath. Suddenly, from within the tangle of mangrove roots, a guttural cry erupted, a sound that was not entirely human, laden with anguish and possessing a ferocity that shattered the fragile calm. The trees seemed to shudder, and the ground trembled under our weight. We spun around, hearts in our throats, and saw movement. A dark, indistinct figure darting between the skeletal trunks. In our flashlights' staccato beams, we caught a glimpse of a face, gaunt, with eyes sunken deep and fixed on us with an expression that was at once desperate and malevolent. The sight was too harrowing for words. Jake's whispered plea to run was drowned out by the cacophony of our pounding hearts. In that desperate moment, my mind raced with the possibility that our collective spring break horror was no aberration of fate but something far more sinister, a force that had been awakened by our intrusion, now demanding remembrance through terror and perhaps sacrifice. That night, as we scrambled back to the safety of our house, the storm intensified. Thunder roared, and lightning sliced through the darkness. The voices seemed to rise again from the surf, louder and more insistent, as though urging us to confront the horrifying truth we had uncovered. I sat later in my room, drenched and shaken, the images of that gaunt, accusing face burning in my mind. I knew then that what we experienced, the disappearance of Brett, the strange etchings, the haunting whispers, were threads in a tapestry of terror that stretched back further than any of us could imagine. Crimson Sands was no mere beach. It was a crucible for the dark secrets of the past. It was as if the souls of those lost in time, forgotten by the world above, had imprinted themselves onto the land and the tide, forever demanding that their memory be preserved in pain and fear. I ended that night by scribbling furiously in my journal, desperate to document every sensation, every whispered command, in the hope that someone, someday, might understand the true horror of that summer. Remember, I wrote, and with that single word, I sealed my fate as much as I invoked the curse that lived on Crimson Sands. I still remember the heat of that late May afternoon, when our group of 4, college sophomores craving one last taste of freedom before finals, stumbled upon a decrepit sign on the outskirts of Cancun. Bienvenidos al refugio perdido. The faded letters barely glowed in the hazy sunlight. We had planned a week of wild parties and sun-drenched beaches, but a mix-up in our booking and a mistaken detour led us here, to a hostel so remote that even seasoned spring breakers spoke of it in hushed, wary tones. "They say the place is cursed," whispered a local taxi driver. We laughed it off, until nightfall. The hostel, nestled amid tangled brush and gnarled trees, appeared as a relic of another era. Its whitewashed walls were streaked with time and neglect, and its once bright murals were peeled and mottled with decay. A low, persistent hum seemed to emanate from the building itself, as if its stones carried a secret sorrow too deep for daylight. We checked in at a creaking desk behind a heavy wooden door. The owner, an older man with eyes that darted nervously, muttered cryptic warnings about not disturbing what lies beneath before he handed us the chipped room keys. The tension in the air felt almost tangible, and we couldn't shake the sensation that we had trespassed on something not meant for casual holiday revelers. That first night was a mixture of uneasy excitement and anxious disbelief. We set up our sleeping bags in a common room lit by a single flickering bulb. Around us, rooms were barely furnished, old cots, dusty rugs, and a few yellowed portraits of long-forgotten guests. The air carried the scent of salt and something musty, old, as if the building itself were exhaling memories of past horrors. Outside, the wind moaned through the palms, and the distant crash of waves reminded us we were on the edge of something vast and indifferent. At midnight, after a few rounds of cheap tequila and attempts to ignore the building's oppressive atmosphere, I slipped out onto the creaking veranda. The tropical night was disturbingly silent. Not even the usual chirp of cicadas broke the heavy air. I stared toward the darkened back of the hostel, where a copse of mangroves rose like skeletal sentinels. In the distance, a pulsing sound emerged, a rhythmic thud that seemed to mimic a heartbeat. I paused, straining to hear. Was it the waves, or a heartbeat that did not belong to any of us? Feeling a surge of morbid curiosity, I quickened my pace toward the sound, unaware that my friends had fallen into a restless sleep inside. As I neared the mangroves, moonlight revealed a narrow trail leading into a tangle of twisted roots and shadows. The pulsing grew louder, accompanied by intermittent rustling, as if something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. I stopped at a clearing where the ground was churned up, and in the center of a shallow depression lay a single glistening pendant. It was intricately shaped, like a small talisman carved with inscrutable symbols I couldn't decipher. A chill ran down my spine, and somewhere in the half-light I thought I saw a figure vanish behind the dark trunks. With a racing heart and trembling fingers, I pocketed the pendant and bolted back to the hostel. The next morning I joined my friends with an unspoken urgency, my mind racing over what I had seen. Over hasty breakfast, we debated the pendant's origins. Mia, whose curiosity often bordered on reckless, insisted we show it to the reception desk. But when I did, the owner's face paled as he snatched it from my hand. In a hushed tone, he muttered, "It belongs to the dead. You must return it. And remember." His eyes darted around until they locked onto mine in a silent plea of warning. I tried to laugh off his words as remnants of superstition, but deep down, an uneasiness had set in. Later that day, while we attempted to salvage some semblance of a normal vacation. Poolside cocktails at a nearby bar, sunbathing that felt like an effort in spite of the ominous morning. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was amiss. Several of us began experiencing odd occurrences. Sarah, always the skeptic, reported that during a late-night walk along an isolated stretch of beach, she saw a woman in a tattered dress wandering aimlessly. The woman's eyes were hollow, yet fixed on something unseen. Jake swore that he saw figures, barely discernible, drifting along the shoreline during a sudden mist that rolled in from the sea. Every whisper of wind seemed to carry fragments of a mournful chant, and that single word from the night before, remember, reverberated in our collective minds as though it were a binding incantation. By the third night, the atmosphere had transformed from uneasy to downright terrifying. An oppressive storm gathered over Crimson Sands, as though the heavens were weeping in solidarity with the silent ghosts of the past. Rain hammered the roof of the hostel, turning the surrounding dirt path into a quagmire, and the wind's howl merged with the crashing waves into an indescribable dirge. That evening, as we huddled in the common room, the lights flickered violently and the air turned inexplicably cold. Outside, through rain-blurred windows, shadowy shapes moved against the tempest. The mangroves swayed as if animated by unseen hands. Around midnight, the terror reached its climax. I awoke to a piercing, blood-curdling scream that shattered the unnatural calm. I scrambled out into the chaos of the storm, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. On the front steps of the hostel, illuminated intermittently by flashes of lightning, I saw a figure. It was an emaciated woman, her dress drenched and torn, standing motionless beneath the mangroves. Her face, pallid and tear-streaked, bore an expression of unbearable sorrow. As I stared, transfixed, she lifted a hand slowly and pointed toward the dark distance, where the broken line of the beach met the restless surf. Then, as if carried away by the storm, she vanished into the torrential downpour. I ran back inside, breath ragged, and recounted the sight to my friends, who huddled together in a state of disbelief and mounting dread. The room fell into a dismal silence punctuated only by the raging storm outside and the distant echoing murmur of voices. In the flickering light, I noticed that the pendant I had taken was missing from my pocket, perhaps returned by some unseen force, or so I dared hope. Over the following days, the horror of that night deepened. Our group was plagued by nightmares and waking terrors. One evening, while we sat on the porch trying to make sense of our collective ordeal, Mia confided that she'd begun hearing a persistent, whispering voice in her ear, barely audible, but insistent in repeating, "Remember," whenever she closed her eyes. Jake, once irreverent, became withdrawn and jittery, constantly glancing over his shoulder as though expecting to see that gaunt figure emerge from the dark. The festive promise of spring break had curdled into a claustrophobic nightmare, and even as we attempted to leave Crimson Sands, pack our bags and flee the oppressive isolation, a deep, inescapable pull seemed to root us to the cursed beach. Late one afternoon, as a sickly light filtered through persistent gray clouds, I found myself compelled to return to the mangroves alone. The lure of answers was too potent to ignore. With only my journal and a faltering flashlight, I trekked along the waterlogged path. The storm had abated into an eerie drizzle, and the beach lay deserted, as if all life had fled. Every step I took crunched softly in the sand, each footprint a fleeting testament to my existence in that forsaken place. Deep within the tangle of dead mangrove roots, I encountered a small clearing dotted with strange, archaic markings. In the center lay remnants of a crude altar, a circle of weathered stones arranged as though to hold a ritual. I knelt and examined the markings. Symbols and jagged lines intersected and spiraled, forming a chaotic script that defied any language I knew. But there, etched into one of the largest stones, was a single word, burned in by fire or salt. Remember. The word pulsed in the low light, echoing in my mind like the steady beat of a distant drum. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached out and traced the incised letters, feeling as if I were touching the very soul of the nightmare that had overtaken Crimson Sands. In that moment, a cacophony of sounds erupted behind me. The rushing of wind, the slamming of branches, and I spun around. For just an instant, I saw the gaunt woman again, her eyes locked on mine with unmistakable anguish. Her lips moved as if to speak, but all I perceived was a guttural whisper, "Remember." The sound cut through the drizzling rain and reverberated through the empty clearing. Terrified yet entranced, I could neither run nor call for help. I was suspended in a terrible moment of clarity, realizing that the curse of this place was not an isolated incident, but an eternal echo of forgotten sorrows. I fled with a pounding heart, stumbling back to the hostel as dusk settled into a brooding night. Back among my friends, I could only recount what I had witnessed in halting, breathless fragments. We swallowed our terror in silence, each of us realizing that the curse of Crimson Sands was a malignant force that would not let go. Some nights we heard windows rattle with unknown gusts, footsteps pacing outside our rooms, and in the stillness, the whisper of that relentless command, "Remember." Our spring break was irrevocably marred by the inexplicable events, and as we finally left the beach, a sense of foreboding gnawed at our souls. We moved on to the bright, bustling life of the college campus, yet each of us carried that nightmarish echo of Crimson Sands with us, a secret scar inscribed on our hearts. Even now, years later, when a sudden gust of wind or the distant crash of surf stirs a memory, I can almost hear that ghostly chorus urging, "Remember." It is a haunting refrain, a permanent reminder that some tragedies and curses refuse to fade away with time. Spring break nightmare. I still remember that humid August when our plan for the ultimate spring break turned into a waking nightmare. My name is Danielle, and I was one of a tight-knit group of college friends desperate for an escape from the drudgery of finals and campus life. We had heard whispers of an old rental property secluded on the outskirts of a little-known coastal town in South Florida, a mansion with a sinister reputation, supposedly cursed by past tragedies. The locals called it the House of Bleeding Mirrors, and though we laughed off the warnings initially, we soon discovered that some legends are born in truth. We arrived late in the afternoon at a stretch of weathered asphalt leading to a property shrouded by towering palms and gnarled oak trees. The mansion loomed before us, a sprawling structure with faded Victorian grandeur, its white paint peeling away to reveal scarred, dark wood beneath. The windows, many of them boarded up, were oddly fashioned with antique stained glass that caught fleeting reflections of the dying sunlight. A tattered sign by the gate read simply, "Welcome." But there was something unsettling about its crooked lettering, as if the house itself was smirking at our intrusion. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp decay and a lingering hint of something metallic, like old blood. The grand foyer, once elegant, now lay in disrepair. Intricate moldings were chipped and twisted, and a large, ornate mirror, a relic hung over a dusty console table, dominated one wall. Its polished surface, though scarred by time, provided a flawless reflection that soon revealed inexplicable imperfections. At odd angles, faint red smudges glistened along its edge, as if the glass were leaking a slow, sinister stain. We joked nervously about it at first, attributing the marks to age and water damage, but a heavy silence soon replaced our light-hearted chatter. That first night, after our initial rounds of laughter and cheap liquor, we held a small party in the parlor. The mansion's sparse decor, lit by flickering candles and the occasional neon glow from our portable speakers, was meant to evoke a retro charm. Instead, every creak of the floorboards, every groan of settling wood, felt like a whispered warning. As the night wore on, we drank and danced around, trying to drown the chill that seemed to emanate from every shadow. But amid the revelry, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching. Every time the music dipped into silence, I felt eyes upon me from the darkened corners. Just past midnight, when the party had dwindled to a few stragglers and I retired to my assigned room for a brief respite before joining the others at the beach, I awoke to a soft, persistent tapping. Half asleep, I sat upright in the dim light of my bedside lamp. The sound, rhythmic and measured, seemed to come from the hallway. At first I assumed it was nothing more than the antique pipes or the wind scraping against the old window frames. But as I lay there, the tapping began to resemble footsteps, steady and deliberate, approaching my door. My pulse quickened, yet I told myself it was my imagination, heightened by the eerie reputation of this house. Unable to sleep, I crept from my room and followed the source of the sound down a long, narrow corridor lined with faded wallpaper and cracked portraits. The tapping led me to a door slightly ajar at the end of the hall. When I pushed it open cautiously, a chill swept over me. The room beyond was small and sparsely furnished, a forgotten sitting room that looked as though it had been sealed off for years. In the center of the floor stood an imposing mirror framed in gilt, its surface covered in swirling patterns that almost looked like bloodstains. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, mournful hum that resonated within my chest. I stepped closer, and in a flash of dim light, I swear I saw a pair of accusing eyes reflected in the mirror before they vanished into darkness. I bolted back to my room, heart pounding, unable to shake the image. The rest of the night was a restless blur of half-dreams and whispered dread. In the morning, the group gathered in a discouraged silence over burnt coffee in the dank kitchen. We exchanged uneasy glances over what each of us had experienced. Odd noises in the corridors, fleeting shapes and reflections, and that overwhelming sense of being invaded by something ancient and sorrowful. One of our friends, Marcus, even confided that he'd noticed his own reflection in a window seemed distorted, as if the mirror was trying to tell him something he couldn't understand. Seeking some rational explanation, we attempted to explore the grounds. Venturing into the overgrown gardens behind the house, we discovered several inexplicable phenomena. Near the back, hidden amid tangled brush and dead palms, we found a circle of old, rusted metal posts, arranged as if they had once supported a canopy. Carved into the weathered posts were symbols, strange, unrecognizable characters interlaced with crude depictions of figures mourning with outstretched arms. In the center of the formation lay fragments of shattered glass, eerily reminiscent of broken mirrors. I felt a profound melancholy clutch my heart as I realized that these symbols, though foreign to us, spoke of undying sorrow, of regret too deep to be forgotten. That evening, we attempted to reclaim some semblance of normalcy by driving off to the beach for a bonfire party under the stars. The ocean was restless, yet inviting, and we hoped that the salt air and crashing waves might wash away the disturbing aura of the mansion. However, as darkness descended and we gathered around the flickering flames, the air grew strangely still. Conversations dwindled when a sudden cold gust knocked out our portable lanterns, plunging us into near darkness. Amid the ephemeral light of the fire, I caught sight of a shadow moving unnaturally along the shoreline, a slender figure, its form barely distinguishable against the inky black of the sea. A collective shiver ran through the group as an inaudible, desperate whisper seemed to ride the breeze. "Remember." The bonfire's light flickered violently, as if disturbed by an unseen force, and I could see in each friend's terrified eyes the dawning realization that the horrors of the house might not be confined within its rotting walls. They had followed us onto the beach. Panic reeled in hushed, frenzied murmurs as we tried to rationalize the inexplicable. Some insisted it was merely the ocean's capricious winds. Others dared not voice the thought that the curse of the House of Bleeding Mirrors might have followed us. The night ended in chaos. Several of us fled back to the house in terror, and the rest huddled near the dying embers of the bonfire, each of us alone with our fear and the unending echoing command of that single word. In the days that followed, as we struggled to continue our spring break despite the constant, lingering dread, subtle signs of the curse escalated. Marcus awoke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, to find his face pressed against the cold glass of a window, his eyes fixated on something outside that he could not see. Sarah, ever the skeptic, began experiencing bouts of dizziness and visions of ghostly figures in the reflective surfaces around campus. We soon learned that our brush with the supernatural had not been an isolated phenomenon confined to the cursed hostel. It was seeping into our lives, a permanent stain on the fabric of our vacation. I personally began to find evidence of the curse in the smallest of details: a tear in a mirror that seemed to bleed red at certain angles, a whisper of a voice when I passed a shadowy corner, and the ever-present echo of "remember" in my quietest moments. The mansion, with its ominous presence and spectral legacy, had left an indelible mark on our souls. Even as we eventually left Crimson Sands behind, the horror we experienced there multiplied in our minds. It wasn't just a haunted house. It was a living, breathing entity, a repository for grief and a harbinger of inexorable despair. Looking back, I realize now that the true horror of that spring break wasn't in any single terrifying event, but in the relentless, pervasive dread that slowly eroded our sanity, our sense of safety, and our ability to forget. The curse of Crimson Sands wasn't something we could simply outrun or erase. It had latched onto us, transforming our once carefree vacation into a lingering nightmare that, even years later, still haunts my dreams. The terror of that stormy bonfire night still clung to us like a suffocating fog. When morning broke after that nightmare, the hostel felt transformed, a mausoleum of sorrow and creeping dread rather than a mere relic of faded grandeur. In the pale light of dawn, we assembled in the near-empty common room, each of us haunted by our private visions, half-formed faces in peripheral mirrors, unexplained cold spots in the corridors, and, above all, that unyielding insistence of one word reverberating in our minds: remember. I, Danielle, could feel that word pulsing inside me with every heartbeat, as if it had taken up permanent residence in my soul. In the hours after our frantic bonfire escape, the oppressive silence in the hostel turned into a sinister dialogue. Marcus, quiet and unnerved, confessed that in his sleep he'd seen a face in the bathroom mirror, a pale countenance with eyes brimming with sorrow that whispered his name. Sarah, once our staunch skeptic, wept silently upon viewing her distorted reflection in a cracked window. She swore the glass bled slow, red rivulets that ran like tears down the frame. Mia, shunning conversation, yet visibly restless, mumbled over broken fragments of memory about a shadow in the hall that beckoned her toward a door where its handle twisted in impossibly slow rotations. And Jake, more withdrawn than before, sat in the corner of the parlor, staring at a faded portrait on the wall that seemed to change expression when he wasn't looking. Determined to find some explanation before our nerves completely unraveled, we decided to conduct a cautious exploration of the upper floor. Even in daylight, the corridors of the house exuded an inescapable melancholy. The wallpaper, once vibrant, now flaked away to reveal dark, water-stained plaster. The floorboards groaned under every step, and large mirrors hung askew in dusty frames, their surfaces mottled with crimson stains that might have been nothing more than rust, or so we hoped. Our exploration began in a cramped hallway lined with faded family photographs whose subjects bore eerily solemn expressions. At one end of the hall, the grand mirror from the foyer, known among us as the Bleeding Mirror, stood as a silent witness to our fate. I dared approach it, heart pounding to examine the strange red streaks that marred its surface. I swiped a trembling finger along one vertical tear in the glass. For an instant, a chill shot through me as I felt, almost imperceptibly, that I was traced by unseen fingertips. I jerked back, nearly colliding with a heavy cabinet that groaned as if in protest. In that moment, the mirror's reflection rippled, and I saw, behind my own horrified eyes, a gaunt figure in a tattered gown, its mouth open in a silent scream. My blood ran cold. Was it merely a trick of light or something far more sinister? Later, together with Marcus and Mia, our de facto investigators, we resolved to search the attic. Rumor had it that previous tenants had left whispered warnings scribbled on the walls, and that the attic might harbor clues to the mansion's dark past. Ascending the narrow, creaking staircase felt like penetrating deeper into a crypt. The musty air was thick with the scent of decaying memories. In the dusty attic, inside a cramped space full of forgotten trunks, faded letters, and moth-eaten relics, we discovered a battered leather journal hidden under a rotted board. Its pages, stained unevenly with dark smudges, bore frantic scrawls about tragic losses, unspeakable rites performed in secret, and a relentless curse. Heed our pain, for if you forget, the mirrors weep and souls are lost to the void. One entry, written in jagged, desperate ink, warned that the house had once been a sanctuary for those condemned by their own grief. The journal hinted that the bleeding mirrors were not mere reflections, but gateways, portals that trapped and revealed the tormented spirits of the past. As we read, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the attic door banged shut behind us. In the flash of a lightning strike, I caught sight of a spectral silhouette in the far corner, a woman in antique attire, head bowed as if in eternal mourning. The sudden silence that followed felt oppressive, as if the house itself was absorbing our terror. I could hear Mia's soft gasp and Marcus whispering, "It's here. It's always here." The pages of the journal fluttered as if caught in an invisible breeze, each rustle echoing off the sagging rafters. We hurriedly retreated from the attic, clutching the journal as if it were a talisman against the encroaching darkness. Down in the corridor, as we reunited with the others, the manor seemed to pulse with a latent energy, the collective grief of countless lost souls. In corners and behind doorways, our flashlights danced across surfaces that appeared to ripple with wavering images. Again and again, I heard that relentless murmur. Remember, it was no longer confined to one place. It was everywhere, stenciled into the very air we breathed. That night, the mansion's terror escalated beyond our ability to retreat indoors. Around midnight, as a torrential rain pounded the ancient roof, we awoke to horrifying sounds echoing throughout the house, a cacophony of scraping, weeping, and whispered voices. In the long corridor leading to my room, I saw the mirror on the wall shifting steadily, its red stains flowing like fresh blood. Outside, through cracked windows, silhouettes moved against the storm, flitting from one shadow to the next with a deliberate, predatory pace. In my room, I was too terrified to sleep. Every creak of the building and every gust of wind felt like the hand of the dead caressing my skin. I huddled beneath a thin blanket, clutching the journal and listening as the voices crescendoed into a mournful chant. Remember, remember, remember. A dirge that seemed to promise that forgetting was the true horror. Morning brought no relief, only a dreadful residue of our shared nightmare. The once boisterous group had grown silent, each person looking haunted, as if burdened by a secret they could neither disclose nor escape. We gathered in the parlor, trying to console one another, but our words were hollow. Marcus had disappeared for hours. When he reappeared, his eyes were glazed, and he murmured about being followed by a pale figure that repeated his name in a voice like broken glass. Sarah, too, quit trying to rationalize the unexplainable. Even Jake, who had been the most irreverent among us, sat in a taunting silence, unable to meet anyone's gaze, as if his soul were shackled to that cursed night. For the remainder of our spring break, the House of Bleeding Mirrors continued its gradual assault on our sanity. We tried to leave the property at first light, but an unforeseen thick fog enveloped the area, trapping us in an inescapable loop of dread. Our rental car, left outside, was found untouched, but smeared with inexplicable streaks of red by the day's end. Attempts at contacting anyone outside, both friends and local authorities, met with static or vague, frightened warnings that encouraged us not to speak of what we'd seen. In whispered conferences, one by one, we agreed that none among us would ever forget the relentless command echoing throughout that accursed house. Its power seeped into our bones, leaving us perpetually glancing at mirrors and reflective surfaces, fearful of the moment when our own faces might betray the secret of the dead. By the time our spring break ended, the house had imprinted itself upon each of us, a lingering horror that no celebration or normalcy could dispel. We departed Crimson Sands in a rush, hearts heavy with unutterable terror and minds forever marked by the curse of the House of Bleeding Mirrors. Even as I returned to campus life, the haunting refrain, "Remember," clung to me like a second skin. In every reflective surface, a shop window, a puddle, a darkened screen, I caught fleeting images of tormented faces and bleeding lights, and I knew that the mansion's sorrow was a permanent part of me. Every time I shut my eyes, I am forced back to that stormy, nightmare-filled night, and I cannot help but wonder if the curse will one day claim more than just memories. I would rather have school. It was supposed to be the highlight of our spring break, a spontaneous road trip to a coastal town none of us had ever heard of, a place that promised adventure and escape from the monotony of college life. The town was called Ashen Cove, a name that sounded quaint and unassuming, nestled somewhere along the Gulf Coast. My friends and I, Emma, Tyler, and Rachel, were eager to leave behind the crowded beaches and overpriced bars of the usual spring break destinations. We wanted something different, something memorable. What we got was far more than we bargained for. The drive into Ashen Cove was uneventful at first, the highway flanked by endless stretches of pine forest and the occasional dilapidated gas station. But as we neared the town, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew heavier, the sky dimmer, as though the sun itself were reluctant to shine on this forgotten corner of the world. The GPS led us down a winding road that seemed to stretch on forever, the trees on either side growing denser and darker. By the time we arrived, the town was shrouded in an eerie twilight, even though it was only mid-afternoon. Ashen Cove was a ghost of a town, its streets lined with crumbling buildings and faded signs. The few locals we saw moved with a sluggish, almost mechanical gait, their faces pale and expressionless. It was as if the town itself had been drained of life. We checked into a small, run-down motel on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly in the gathering gloom. The receptionist, an elderly woman with hollow eyes, barely acknowledged us as she handed over the keys. "You're here for the carnival, aren't you?" she asked in a voice that was little more than a whisper. We exchanged confused glances. "What carnival?" Tyler asked, but the woman didn't answer. She simply stared at us for a moment before turning away, muttering something under her breath. That evening, as we wandered the desolate streets in search of food, we stumbled upon a flyer pinned to a telephone pole. It was old and weathered, the edges curling and the ink faded, but the words were still legible. "The Carnival of Shadows, one night only." Beneath the text was an address, scrawled in a shaky hand. "This has to be a joke," Emma said, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Rachel, ever the thrill-seeker, was immediately intrigued. "We have to check it out," she insisted. "How often do you get to go to a creepy carnival in the middle of nowhere?" Against our better judgment, we decided to go. The address led us to the outskirts of town, to a sprawling field surrounded by dense woods. The carnival was already in full swing when we arrived, its garish lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The air was thick with the scent of popcorn and cotton candy, mingling with something metallic and faintly rotten. The sound of calliope music drifted through the air, cheerful yet discordant, like a melody played on an out-of-tune piano. At first glance, the carnival seemed almost normal. There were rides and games, food stalls and fortune tellers, and a crowd of people milling about. But something about it felt off. The rides were old and rusted, their paint peeling and their mechanisms groaning with every movement. The game booths were manned by figures whose faces were obscured by shadow, their voices low and monotone. And the crowd was wrong. The people moved with an unnatural grace, their expressions vacant, their laughter hollow. It was as if they were actors in a play, going through the motions without any real emotion. We tried to shake off the unease and enjoy ourselves. Tyler and Rachel went to try their luck at the ring toss, while Emma and I wandered toward the Ferris wheel. As we approached, I noticed a figure standing near the base of the ride. A tall man in a tattered suit, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move or speak, but I could feel his gaze on us, cold and unblinking. "Let's go somewhere else," I said, pulling Emma away. She didn't argue. As the night wore on, the carnival grew stranger. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting long, shifting shadows across the field. The music became more erratic, the cheerful notes giving way to dissonant chords that set my teeth on edge. The crowd thinned, and the few people who remained seemed to blur at the edges, their features indistinct. I began to notice things that didn't make sense. Rides that appeared in one place and then another. Booths that seemed to vanish when I looked away. And always, in the corner of my vision, I saw the tall man in the tattered suit, watching. It was Rachel who first suggested we leave. "This place is giving me the creeps," she said, her voice trembling. Tyler nodded in agreement, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. But as we made our way toward the exit, we realized something was wrong. The path we had taken to enter the carnival was gone, replaced by a dense wall of trees. The lights of the rides and booths seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. Panic set in as we tried to find another way out, but every path led us back to the center of the carnival. And then the lights went out. In an instant, the cheerful neon glow of the carnival, which had seemed so inviting only moments before, was replaced by a suffocating blanket of darkness. I remember that instant with painful clarity, the sudden plunge into blackness that swallowed every bonfire, every flickering lamp, and turned the colorful chaos into a void. In the midst of the pitch-black night, our hearts pounded in unison as we stumbled through the oppressive darkness, our eyes desperately searching for even the faintest sliver of light. I could hear the frantic shouts of my friends echoing in the darkness. Rachel's voice, usually so bold and irreverent, was now strained with absolute terror. Tyler's laughter, which had once resonated with irreverent bravado as we roamed the carnival grounds, had turned into desperate pleas and incoherent murmurs. Emma clutched my arm as we fumbled blindly along a path that we once thought led to the exit of the carnival grounds. Every step seemed to amplify the terror. Each echo of our footfalls was swallowed by the air, as though the darkness itself were hungry for our fear. It wasn't just our voices that filled the night. In that shocking silence, a low and dissonant hum emerged from the darkness. The same eerie melody that had been playing faintly throughout the evening, now raised into a full-blown chorus. It reverberated around us, a spectral dirge that gripped our souls with its relentless insistence. "Remember, remember." It whispered along the edges of our consciousness, an almost hypnotic command that blurred the line between memory and nightmare. In our rush to escape, we found ourselves disoriented. The familiar layout of the carnival, the gaudy rides, the crooked booths, that towering Ferris wheel that now loomed like a jagged specter, had all transformed into unfamiliar silhouettes. One moment we were sure we were following the path we'd taken earlier. The next, that path dissolved into a labyrinth of dead ends and unrecognizable alleys. The carnival's very structure seemed to shift under the weight of the darkness. At times, when brief flashes of lightning illuminated the scene, the carnival looked distorted and monstrous. Stretched shadows of figures dancing in an unearthly rhythm, their faces hidden and their movements eerily alien. I found myself separated from the group. In the chaos, I had lost sight of Tyler and Emma. Only Rachel was clinging to me, her eyes wide and brimming with unshed tears of terror. We pressed forward, guided solely by the instinct to survive, and the distant, mournful echo of that one word. Every now and then, I caught fleeting glimpses of something moving just beyond the edge of our flashlight beams, a figure that darted away, a pair of eyes that glimmered briefly, then vanished into the darkness. Was it a trick of the light, or something far more sinister? With every step, the oppressive feeling of being observed grew stronger. I could almost sense invisible hands brushing the back of my neck, as if our trespass had awakened those long-forgotten souls that haunted this forsaken place. The carnival, once just a temporary escape from college routines, was now an inescapable nightmare, a living, breathing malignancy that had seized our spring break. As we reached what we hoped was the outer edge of the carnival, we encountered an impassable barrier, a row of makeshift stalls and game booths that had transformed into a wall of distorted shapes. In the brief moments when our flashlights flickered back to life with the intermittent return of power, I saw that the wall was covered in cryptic scribbles and crude drawings. They depicted tormented faces and outstretched hands, a chaotic motley of anguish. Some of us later speculated in trembling voices that these might be the desperate messages of previous victims, warnings etched by those who had been trapped in this carnival long before us. In that murky moment, a distant scraping sound echoed behind us. We turned, and our eyes, too terrified to fully open, beheld a silhouette that approached with deliberate slowness, a tall, gaunt figure whose head was bowed, as if burdened by endless sorrow. Its eyes, if they could be seen at all in the darkness, shone with a hollow luminescence that seemed to bore straight through my very soul. For a heartbeat, time slowed. The figure raised a trembling hand, and in a voice that was barely more than the rustle of dry leaves, it intoned, "Remember." The word resonated with such an all-consuming melancholy that I felt my will waver. I struggled to tear my eyes away as a sickening realization set in. This was not merely a trick of the mind, but a visitation, a warning that we were not alone in this perpetual nightmare. Our panic eventually gave way to a disjointed kind of resolve. We realized that we might not be able to leave this cursed carnival until the oppressive power that held it together was broken. Somehow, we had to confront the source of the dreadful command that haunted every shadow and every echo. Remember. That single word, repeated like a broken mantra, felt like it held the secret to everything. The anguish of lost souls, the curse that had imprisoned this place in perpetual twilight, perhaps even the fate of those who dared to intrude. Using the faint glow of our remaining flashlights as a guide, we forced our way past the stalls and through narrow passageways until we reached a central clearing. Here, the carnival's residual vibrancy was replaced by an eerie emptiness. In the center of the clearing stood an old carousel, its painted horses frozen in time, their eyes seeming to shimmer with the sorrow of countless years. The carousel's music, once cheerful and whimsical, was now warped and distorted, a broken melody that looped over and over in a maddening refrain. Under the pallid light of a few salvaged lanterns, I noticed that the carousel's mirrors were somehow different. Their surfaces, cracked and smeared with streaks of deep red, reflected not only the physical world, but also scenes of unspeakable horror, fleeting apparitions of carnival goers, their faces twisted in terror, caught in moments of perpetual grief. I stepped forward, drawn inexorably to the carousel, as though it were the heart of the carnival's curse. Rachel clutched my arm to pull me back, her voice trembling. "We shouldn't. This is wrong. We need to leave." But I could not turn away. In the fractured reflections dancing across the mirrors, I saw not only our terrified expressions, but also ghostly images that seemed to merge with our own. In one brief moment, I thought I saw the spectral face of the gaunt figure we'd encountered, looming behind us in every mirror, always whispering that terrible command. Remember. As if in response, a gust of wind, cold and unnatural, swept through the clearing. The carousel began to creak and shudder, its music escalating into a discordant wail. The mirrors trembled in their frames, and then, without warning, shattered. Glass cascaded like deadly raindrops, each shard catching a glimmer of the eerie light, scattering fragments of reflections into the night. Amid the chaos of shattering glass and the panicked cries of our small group, something even more horrifying occurred. The broken mirrors, lying scattered upon the ground, appeared to act as portals, 1,000 windows into a past of tortured existence. In each fragment, I saw fleeting images of horrific events. A carnival once teeming with life, now reduced to agony, people clutching at their eyes as they were swallowed by darkness, and above all, a relentless, tormented chorus chanting the word "remember." For what felt like an eternity, I stood transfixed in that moment of macabre revelation. The past, the present, and perhaps even a bleak vision of the future converged in those jagged shards of glass, a desperate record of pain and loss that refused to be forgotten. Then, as abruptly as it had all begun, the shattered mirrors settled, and the carousel's music died away into a heavy silence. That silence was more oppressive than the noise that had preceded it. We huddled together in the clearing, the air thick with an unnameable dread. Tyler was the first to break the silence, his voice ragged. "We need to get out of here." But even as he spoke, I felt something tugging at the edges of my mind. A beckoning call from the very heart of the carnival that promised we could not simply walk away from what we had witnessed. Every step away from the clearing felt like abandoning a part of ourselves, leaving behind memories that had etched themselves deep into our souls. In the ensuing moments, the carnival grounds seemed to come alive with a quiet menace. Shadows loomed larger, and every whisper of wind carried the mournful chant of "remember." The ground beneath our feet pulsed as if it had a heartbeat, and I caught sight of reflections in puddles on the cracked asphalt, faces twisted in anguish, and eyes pleading for salvation. A palpable chill slithered rapidly through us, and I couldn't tell if it was simply the after-effects of our terror or something that had been awakened by our intrusion into the carnival's cursed domain. With no visible exit in sight, our group was forced to wander through a maze of abandoned attractions and derelict booths, our only guide the intermittent fragments of fragmented neon and the desperate repetition of that word. In a narrow alleyway lined with peeling posters and rusted ticket booths, Emma gasped when a mirror on the wall suddenly flared with an unearthly light. In its reflection, she swore she saw her own face morph into something inhuman, an expression of despair etched in eternal agony. The realization struck me with paralyzing terror. It was as if the carnival was slowly reclaiming our identities, imprinting its curse upon us in subtle, irreversible ways. Time lost all meaning as we staggered through that labyrinth of terror. The voices grew louder, more insistent, seeming to emanate from the very foundation of the carnival. I remember a moment when, in a state of near hysteria, I cried out, "Who are you? What do you want from us?" And the answer came, a low, resonant tone that filled the silence. "Remember, or be forgotten." Those words echoed in my mind with a finality that chilled my blood. At length, we stumbled upon a narrow exit, a broken chain-link fence set against the backdrop of a stagnant parking lot where the carnival lights had long since faded. In our frantic escape, we didn't look back, but the word "remember" continued to haunt us with every labored step. We piled into the rental car, its engine sputtering to life as if reluctant to part ways with the cursed night, and fled into the pre-dawn gloom. In the hours that followed our escape, the world outside seemed to return to a semblance of normalcy, the oppressive weight of the carnival slowly lifting as the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon. Yet, even in the light, we were forever changed. In the days after that terrifying night, each of us tried in our own way to dismiss the disturbing images and incessant whispers as the product of alcohol-fueled hysteria. We returned to campus, to classes, and to the expected banality of everyday life. But the memory of Ashen Cove and its forgotten carnival clung to us like a shadow. I began to notice unsettling occurrences in my own reflection. In the mirror, for a moment, my eyes would darken with a sadness that wasn't my own. In puddles on the sidewalk, I'd catch a glimpse of faces that vanished when I blinked. Tyler, once a beacon of unshakable confidence, became a reclusive figure, rarely speaking and often staring blankly at reflective surfaces. Emma and Rachel found themselves plagued by nightmares, visions of the gaunt man in the tattered suit and the spectral figures of the carnival, their faces contorted in sorrowful agony. I tried to rationalize these experiences, attributing them to the trauma of that night. Yet, deep down, I knew there was something far more sinister at work, a curse that had seized our souls and would not be easily undone. The carnival had made its mark on us with its relentless command. Remember. It was a demand that echoed through our thoughts, a macabre promise that we would never fully escape the horror we had encountered. Weeks turned into months, and though life resumed its ordinary pace, the nightmares never ceased. I often found myself drawn to dark places, compulsively searching for any sign that the carnival's cursed legacy had followed me home. I would catch fleeting glimpses of that spectral refrain in the gleam of a window or the glint of a street lamp. The word "remember" was etched into my consciousness, a persistent reminder of that night of unspeakable horror. As I write these words now, I am haunted by the knowledge that some terrors are not confined to one place or one moment. They live on, bridging time and space to reclaim what was once lost. The forgotten carnival of Ashen Cove may have been an isolated aberration, a twisted sanctuary for restless souls, but its echo has infiltrated our lives. Every time I close my eyes, I see the shattered mirrors, the ghostly figures, and that relentless command that will never be silenced. I have since tried to seek answers, visiting local libraries, combing through old town records, and speaking in hushed voices to those who still remember the carnival's heyday. But nothing can dispel the dread that clings to me. All that remains is the inescapable truth that in our pursuit of thrill and escape, we unwittingly opened the door to a nightmare that will haunt us forever. The carnival's legacy is not simply a collection of disturbing memories. It is a living curse, a spectral wail that demands we never forget what we witnessed, lest we too become lost to its eternal, sorrowful dance. And so, even as the world around me continues on with its mundane rhythms, I live in a state of perpetual disquiet, a prisoner to the haunting refrain that will forever echo in the corners of my mind. Remember. The Shoreline Stalker. It began with promises of liberation and reckless abandon, a mythic escape from the monotony of campus life. My friends and I had long planned our spring break pilgrimage to Hawthorne Bay, a secluded stretch of sand on Florida's forgotten coast. We'd heard rumors of its pristine beauty, of nights lit only by the brilliant tapestry of stars and the raw pulse of the ocean waves. But as soon as we arrived, Hawthorne Bay revealed a darker legacy that none of us could have anticipated. Our rental house sat precariously at the edge of the dunes, its weathered boards and salt-stained windows testifying to decades of neglect. We swept the space with eager excitement, decorating the common area with string lights and boom boxes, our voices rising in anticipation of the nights to come. The first day was surreal, sweltering heat, the tang of sea salt in our every breath, and endless laughter under the glaring sun. But as dusk crept over the horizon, a creeping unease began to settle. That first night, after a few rounds of cheap liquor and beachside bonfires, the atmosphere shifted. I awoke in the early hours to a heavy stillness, a silence so complete that even the familiar crash of waves against the shore seemed muted. Restlessness drove me out onto the balcony of our rental house, where the inky night swallowed the landscape. The moon was a sliver, its light feeble against the vast darkness. As I peered across the dunes, I noticed an unusual disturbance, a series of footprints pressed into the wet sand that seemed too deliberate for random beachcombers. They led from near the shoreline up into the dunes, winding in an erratic pattern that defied explanation. My heart hammered as I followed the prints from a safe distance. They were deep and unsteady, as if made by someone burdened by an unnatural heaviness. The footprints halted abruptly where the sand met a line of rugged, wind-battered sea oats. For a moment I wondered if it were the result of a drunken misstep by one of my friends, but no one had ventured out after curfew. An eerie sensation prickled along my skin, as though unseen eyes were fixed upon me from the darkness beyond the dunes. Later that morning, I recounted my discovery to the group over a hasty breakfast of stale bagels and lukewarm coffee. Tyler, always the skeptic, shrugged it off as a prank or the work of an overactive local. Hawthorne Bay wasn't known for its visitors, yet Laura, whose intuition had often proven unerring, looked visibly shaken. "I saw someone last night," she whispered, her voice trembling, "a silhouette lurking behind the dunes. I swear it wasn't one of us." A pall of dread fell over us, and although we attempted to dismiss it as mere paranoia fueled by midnight jitters, an unspoken tension began to fester. That afternoon, we ventured to the beach to shake off our apprehensions. The sun was high, and the ocean roared in a way that was both mesmerizing and threatening. Children's laughter echoed in passing families, and for a brief moment it seemed the world had returned to normal. But as we set up chairs and spread towels on the sands, I couldn't rid my mind of the footprints and the uneasy feeling that someone, or something, had been watching. Every time the tide came in, the sand shifted, and with it came the faint, ghostly imprint of a solitary figure. In the stone-like silence following a receding wave, I could almost hear a low, mournful hum, a sound that, in its cadence, spoke of lost time and the weight of unseen memories. As dusk approached again, we congregated near a crackling bonfire. The flames danced with a frantic energy, their glow a defiant beacon against the encroaching darkness. Laughter resumed, and conversations turned to ghost stories and local legends, daring to reframe our mounting terror as mere folklore. But as the heat of the fire mingled with the cold night air, I found myself glancing toward the dunes, where a shadow seemed to move too deliberately to be an illusion. At one point, as if drawn by a morbid compulsion, I excused myself and stepped away from the circle. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the rhythmic whisper of the surf. I could feel eyes on me, a prickling sensation along my neck that made my skin stand on end. In the pale light of a stray lantern, I made out a figure at the far edge of the beach, a tall, cloaked shape that hovered near the waterline. The figure was motionless, its stance rigid as though frozen in time. I called out softly, unsure if it were friend or foe, but the figure did not respond. Instead, a gust of wind swept across the beach and the outline dissolved into the dark. I returned, troubled and disoriented, and rejoined my friends at the bonfire. But the image wouldn't leave me. It burrowed beneath my thoughts with relentless persistence. In the following days, we began to experience even more unsettling occurrences. Night after night, inexplicable sounds emanated from beneath the dunes, the scrape of sand against wood, distant voices too low to decipher, and the constant, haunting echo of footsteps. On one particularly stifling night, as a tropical downpour lashed against our windows, Tyler woke up to find large, sinuous scratches on his door, as though a long, clawed hand had attempted to pry it open from the outside. We all found ourselves drawn into an atmosphere of dread, where every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, became a potential harbinger of horror. I started sketching the footprints I'd seen, desperate to capture their disturbing irregularity, and I pored over online forums and local news archives late into the night. There, buried within a network of half-forgotten web pages, I discovered an old article about a series of disappearances along the very stretch of beach we now occupied. These reports, dating back decades, told of a mysterious shoreline stalker, a figure said to roam the sands, preying on those who dared to venture too close to the water after dark. Survivors spoke in hushed tones of seeing a gaunt silhouette, of hearing its ragged breath mingled with the crashing of waves, and of inexplicably vanishing footprints that led into nothingness. The name alone sent shivers down my spine. That revelation turned our brewing anxiety into palpable terror. One night, after another round of fruitless search parties along the beach yielded only the eerie, shifting patterns in the sand, Laura confided that she'd seen more than just footprints. She had glimpsed the face of the shoreline stalker. It was twisted in agony, she insisted, her voice barely a whisper as though afraid to summon the horror again. I swear it looked right at me, like it was pleading, or warning me not to forget. The statement resonated with a terrible irony, because in our collective attempts to dismiss the legend, We had forced it into the forefront of our minds, and in turn the curse sank deeper into our souls. One particularly oppressive evening, driven by a mix of desperation and an uncontrollable need for answers, I gathered a small group: Laura, who had become my closest confidant in this unfolding nightmare, and Tyler, whose initial skepticism had now vanished so we could set up a quiet vigil on the beach. Armed with a digital recorder, a camera, and our raw, unfiltered fear, we sat for hours beneath a bruised sky. The ocean was a dark, surging expanse, and the monotony of the crashing waves was laced with intermittent, inaudible whispers. Every so often, the recorder would capture a low murmur, a chilling series of syllables that sounded eerily like a desperate plea. "Remember, never forget, come back." Our hearts pounded as we listened over and over, each playback dredging up fresh torrents of anxiety and despair. As the night deepened, a dense fog rolled in from the sea, shrouding the beach in an almost impenetrable mist. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and every sound was amplified: a disembodied sob, the shifting of sand, a distant, forlorn cry. In that thick gloom, I distinctly heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, deliberate, measured steps that circled our small camp. Fumbling in the dark, I pointed the camera toward the origin of the noise, trying in vain to capture a glimpse of something inhuman. For a moment, the screen flickered and revealed a gaunt face, half obscured by shadow and mist. A face that was contorted with a mix of anguish and malevolence, its eyes hollow and pleading. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only a lingering chill and the maddening echo of that one word. I don't know how long we sat there, gripped by terror and unable to summon the strength to flee. When we finally bolted towards the only semblance of safety, the rental house, the pounding of our hearts drowned out every other sound. We locked every door behind us and huddled together in a panic-stricken silence, barely daring to breathe. There, in the forced quiet of that nightmare, the relentless murmur of the beach haunted our every thought. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that gaunt face, feel the cold weight of unseen eyes upon me, and hear the whispered command echo: "Remember." Even now, as I recount these events with trembling hands, and a mind that still struggles to distinguish nightmare from waking horror, I wonder what became of the others who walked that doomed stretch of sand decades ago. There is no official record beyond murmur and rumor, only the lingering evidence left in the swirling footprints and ghostly whispers carried on the ocean breeze. Our spring break, which had promised joy and liberation, devolved into an unending descent into terror, a time when youthful exuberance was irreversibly stained with the indelible imprint of the shoreline stalker. I never imagined that a quest for adventure could lead to the unraveling of one's sanity, but our spring break at Blackwater Point changed everything. My name is Nick, and along with 3 of my closest college friends, Mia, Jordan, and Devin, we had planned a coastal getaway with promises of sun, surf, and a few harmless dares. Blackwater Point was a small, windswept town on Florida's forgotten East Coast, known only to a handful of locals and urban explorers as the home of an ancient, rotting pier. It was said that this pier, abandoned for decades, was a portal to darkness, a place where the echoes of drowned sailors and lost souls mingled with the ocean mist. Although the warnings were dismissed as local superstition, our youthful arrogance would soon come to bitter fruition. Our journey began innocently enough. We pulled into Blackwater Point in an old station wagon, its faded color and clattering engine a perfect contrast to the pristine tropical beaches we'd envisioned for our break. The town itself was nearly deserted, a few weathered storefronts, a diner that served greasy burgers, and an unsettling quiet that pressed in as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. In the local rental office, the landlady's tired eyes and whispered admonitions, "Don't wander down to the pier after dark, boys. It's not safe," fell on deaf ears. We chalked it up to her superstitions and left with an antique, creaking beach house for our base of operations. At midday, with the weight of the humid Atlantic sun beating down on us, we decided to explore. The beach was lovely, But an inexplicable pull drew us further along the coast. Through overgrown dunes and along a narrow, salt-crusted road, we finally came upon the infamous abandoned pier. Stretching out into a stormy, turbulent bay, its warped wooden beams and rusted metal walkways groaned under the weight of time. Black water lapped at its splintered pilings, and sea mist clung to every surface like a shroud. Even under the hazy light of day, the pier exuded an atmosphere of decay and sorrow, a relic that had witnessed happier times, now reduced to a ghostly skeleton standing against the relentless tide. We dared each other with hushed laughter. "Bet you wouldn't cross it after dark," Mia had teased, a sparkle of mischief in her eyes. Our laughter, seemingly defiant in the face of local warnings, betrayed our own hidden unease. For reasons we couldn't articulate, my fingers trembled as I reached out to run my hand along the balustrade. The wood was slick with salt water and cold to the touch, almost alive in its decay, as if it pulsed with memories best left forgotten. That evening, emboldened by a mix of liquid courage and reckless youth, we made a pact to return to the abandoned pier after sundown. We set up a crude camp on the sand near the pier's base, lighting a small fire as twilight bled into night. The moon was a dim crescent, barely illuminating the skeletal structure of the pier and casting elongated shadows that danced at the edges of our vision. Jordan joked about ghosts and the lost souls of drowned sailors, but his humor did little to mask the palpable tension that gripped us beneath the starless sky. As we sat near the flickering fire, a strange, low rumble began to echo from the direction of the pier. It was subtle at first, like the distant roll of thunder on the horizon, but gradually it morphed into a persistent creaking sound, as though the structure itself were groaning in agony. The sound cut through our conversation and left us silent, listening intently. It was then that Mia swore she heard a whisper drifting on the wind, so faint it could have been imagined. "Remember?" The words sent a shiver racing down my spine. We exchanged uneasy glances. Even Devon, usually the bravest among us, looked shaken. Nevertheless, our collective curiosity outweighed our dread. With our phones turned off to avoid any distractions, we wanted an unfiltered encounter. We gathered our flashlights and ventured toward the pier. The path was treacherous in the dark. The beach, usually a friendly expanse, morphed into a labyrinth of half-seen shapes, and every step seemed to swallow the sound of our footfalls. When we reached the pier's entrance, a gaping maw of rotting wood and twisted metal, the air was heavy and damp, carrying the sharp tang of brine and decay. The boards creaked underfoot in a cadence that matched my racing heartbeat. I held my flashlight high, its beam slicing through the darkness, revealing splintered planks, rusted bolts, and fleeting reflections of our pale faces. About halfway along the pier, as we walked in a tight circle scanning the murk for any signs of life, an overwhelming silence descended. It was as if the cacophony of the crashing waves was stifled by an unseen force. In that suppressive quiet, I became aware of movement at the edge of my vision, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the darkness behind us. I turned quickly, but nothing was there except the endless expanse of water and the derelict structure. Then the sound came, a soft, scraping noise, like the friction of a long-forgotten object being dragged along the weathered wood. It was followed by that same whispered word again, "Remember," echoed just beyond where our flashlights reached. Mia's hand gripped my arm tightly. "Guys, do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice quivering with both fear and an inexplicable familiarity. We huddled closer together as the sound grew ever so slightly louder, a slow, deliberate scraping that felt too measured, as if someone or something was drawing our attention deliberately. The beam of my flashlight caught a glimpse, a flash of something pale skittering along the planks near the far end of the pier. I squinted into the darkness, as if trying to force the image to stay, but it dissolved into the inky black like smoke. Before we could decide whether to flee or investigate further, a sudden gust of wind slammed into us, extinguishing our makeshift lantern and plunging us into obsidian night. Panic surged. and we scrambled for our flashlights, our breaths ragged in the sudden chill. In the pitch dark, our voices were lost, replaced by the overwhelming sound of our pounding hearts and the insistent, almost mournful scrape resuming as if in a loop. We finally relit our flashlights and continued, our nervous energy transforming into a desperate need for answers. At the far end of the pier, near what seemed to be a collapsed section of the boardwalk, we discovered an old, weathered plaque half buried in the sand. Its brass letters, dulled by decades of corrosion, spelled out a name: Sailor Edmund. Next to it, crudely carved into a chunk of rotted wood, was a single word: remember. At that moment, an inexplicable sadness filled me, as if the plaque was not merely a marker of a man long dead, but a conduit for his final, unfulfilled plea. It was then that a figure emerged from behind the tangle of broken support beams, a gaunt, spectral silhouette that glowed faintly in the beam of my flashlight. The figure was of a man dressed in the ragged remnants of what might once have been a sailor's uniform. His eyes, hollow and exhausted, met mine, and for an eternity in that brief, agonizing moment, I felt the depth of his anguish. He raised his hand slowly, and in a voice that was the rustle of dead leaves and the lapping of waves, he whispered, "Remember." His tone was not menacing so much as it was pleading, a desperate call to keep his memory alive. Then, as if carried away by the tide, he dissipated into the darkness. We stood frozen, paralyzed by what we had witnessed. It was as if the apparition had been the final guardian of the pier, a remnant of a bygone era whose soul had become entwined with the very structure of this desolate place. The word "remember" reverberated around us, as if the very walls of the abandoned pier bled with its sorrow. In that moment, I knew with harrowing clarity that our lives had become inextricably linked to this cursed stretch of wood and water. The haunted past of Blackwater Point had come looking for us, and it demanded to be remembered above all else. The rest of the night passed in a state of numbing terror. We left the pier in a daze, our footsteps quick, and our eyes untrusting of every shadow. Once back at the rental house, the oppressive atmosphere inside mirrored that outside. Sleep was elusive. Every creak and distant sound seemed amplified against the backdrop of our harrowing encounter. In the following days, the remnants of that night haunted our every action. I could not escape the sight of the gaunt sailor's eyes in every reflective surface. Even in my own glass of water, a faint, sorrowful visage seemed to linger, silently mouthing the same desperate command: remember. Friends who once laughed off ghost stories now spoke in hushed tones of inexplicable feelings of loss. Mia, especially, would often be found staring blankly at the roiling ocean, her eyes distant and haunted. Jordan tried to rationalize the event as a trick of the light or a shared hallucination brought on by fear, but even he could not dismiss the overwhelming sense of finality in the sailor's whispered words. And Devon, silent and brooding, ditched our car the moment we left Blackwater Point, driving off as if fleeing from a terrifying obligation. In the weeks that followed our return to campus, the memories of that night at the abandoned pier refused to fade. I began piecing together the scant history of Blackwater Point from old newspaper clippings and local folklore. The records were sparse, but revealed a tragic tale. Sailor Edmund had once been a local legend, a man whose love for a woman lost at sea had driven him to madness. Desperate to keep her memory alive, he had carved messages along the pier, begging the world to remember the true cost of love and loss. In time, as storms battered Blackwater Point and the pier decayed into ruin, his pleas had become one with the folklore of the area, a haunting reminder that some souls never leave, and some curses demand to be acknowledged. Now, every time I see a reflective surface, a puddle after rain, a darkened window, even the screen of a phone, I see his face, hear his sorrowful whisper, and feel the inexorable pull of that dreadful command. I find myself unable to escape the haunting refrain that every shadow, every creak of old wood seems to echo: remember. And as the days grow shorter, and the bitter taste of that memory never quite fades, I know that Blackwater Point and its abandoned pier will forever be etched in my soul. a scar that no time or distance can heal. The sinister pool. It began with the promise of endless summer nights and the raucous freedom of spring break. My friends and I had pooled our savings for a much-anticipated getaway at a secluded villa near a vast mirror-like lake on the edge of a sleepy desert town. The villa, an old relic with faded grandeur, boasted an infinity pool that shimmered like liquid silver under the scorching daylight. Local whispers had mentioned strange happenings in this very spot, and while we dismissed such tales as the overactive imaginings of superstitious locals, we would soon learn that some secrets refused to stay buried. We arrived on a sweltering afternoon, the station wagon's clamor contrasting with the hushed isolation of the villa. The building itself exuded a tired elegance, its ivy-clad stone walls and time-worn details hinting at a storied past. Yet, from the moment we set foot on the property, an inexplicable tension clung to the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the stillness of that lake was watching us, something lurking in its depths beyond the ordinary reflection of a cloudless sky. That evening, as dusk melted into a blood-orange horizon, we transformed the villa's backyard into a makeshift haven of party lights and thumping music. Laughter and lively chatter filled the night as we ventured into the pool, its water cool and inviting. For a few blissful hours we surrendered to careless abandon, but as midnight approached, the mood shifted and subtle anomalies began to surface. I was lounging at the edge of the pool when I noticed that the surface did not quite mirror the starry sky above. There, amidst the ripples, floated a distorted image, a face half hidden by dark water, its eyes shining with a sorrow that seemed impossibly ancient. At first, I assumed what I saw was a trick of the light or the result of my overactive imagination under the influence of a few too many drinks. Yet, as the night deepened, so did the intensity of the disturbing visions. Some of my friends began to murmur about seeing figures in the reflections that didn't move in tandem with their own gestures. Others spoke in hushed tones of a faint, mournful chant that repeated over and over, a single word so plaintive and resonant that it sent chills through my spine. Remember, there was an eerie synchronicity to the phenomena, as if the pool were a portal to a past drenched in unforgotten grief, a repository of memories so potent that they could disturb the veil between life and something far more sinister. Unable to dismiss the mounting dread, a few of us gathered one particularly oppressive night to confront the source of our terror. The party had dwindled to a few disjointed souls, their voices low and eyes distant as they congregated around the pool under a crooked, half-lit moon. Drawn like moths to a flame, we edged closer to the water's boundary. In that moment of uneasy stillness, the usual clamor of drunken laughs and splashing was replaced by a heavy silence. I stepped forward, my heart hammering so loud I feared it might shatter the oppressive quiet, and stared into the inky abyss. For a fleeting heartbeat, I locked eyes with a spectral visage, gaunt, with desperate eyes that seemed to plead for liberation. The eyes vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a residue of cold terror and the echo of the desperate word. The following morning, the sun rose over the lake as if nothing had happened. Yet the memory of that spectral encounter clung to our minds like an unwelcome shadow. We attempted to dismiss the incident as a mere hallucination brought on by alcohol and excitement, but the word "remember" continued to echo in every reflective surface we encountered that day, from the surface of the pool to the polished chrome of an abandoned car by the villa. My attempts to rationalize were futile. The viscous mystery of that night had imprinted itself on my soul. Each time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the cold weight of those mournful eyes and hear the faint, sorrow-laden whisper calling from the depths. In the days that followed, normal college life resumed with its bustling schedules and crowded classes. Yet a part of me remained irrevocably tethered to that cursed pool. I scoured old newspapers and local lore, desperate to unearth any reference to the strange powers said to dwell beneath the water's surface. Faded records hinted at tragic events, a series of drownings mysteriously linked to the lake, and eyewitness accounts from decades past, where grief-stricken faces emerged from the water under inexplicable circumstances. Survivors spoke in whispers of a curse, an ancient sorrow that clung to the waters, demanding that the memories of those lost be never forgotten. Even now, in moments of solitude, I catch my reflection in a window or a dark puddle and see the flicker of that spectral gaze, a reminder that what we witnessed was no product of a drunken fancy. The relentless command to remember haunts me in the silence between heartbeats, and I fear that the pool's sinister magic has seeped deeper than I can comprehend. It serves as a constant pulsing reminder that some tragedies, some dark secrets, do not fade with the dawn. They persist, lurking in the shadows of memory and water. I continue to live with that dread, a lingering scar on an otherwise ordinary life. The sinister pool has claimed a part of me, transforming the carefree promise of spring break into an endless cycle of haunted recollections, each reflective surface, each ripple on a quiet lake, a gateway to a past that demands to be remembered. I couldn't shake the relentless pull of that night by the pool. Even as daylight returned to dress the villa in warm hues, something inside me remained locked in that chilling moment of revelation. I spent that morning with vacant eyes, mechanically going through our routine of breakfast and beach trips, but every calm ripple on the water's surface echoed in my mind like a dark reminder. It wasn't long before the nightmares returned. In quiet moments between classes and group projects back on campus, I caught reflections in puddles, or even in the matte finish of a coffee cup that bore a ghostly face, a visage filled with sorrow, as if pleading for rescue from a fate it had long endured. Each time, I tried to convince myself they were nothing but tricks of my tired eyes, yet the sensation of being watched lingered like a tangible presence. Haunted by these memories, I found myself compelled to return to the villa, to confront the truth lurking beneath that mirror-like lake. I arranged a solitary visit during a long weekend when the campus was silent. Stepping off the bus into that remote town felt like landing in a forgotten world. The gravel driveway still carried the echoes of our earlier spring break, and the villa's weathered facade greeted me with indifferent silence. I walked slowly through the overgrown garden, each step stirring the embers of a dread that had embedded itself in my bones over the past months. My mind recalled every detail: the distorted reflection in the pool, the whispered command that had turned jubilant laughter into hushed terror, and the overwhelming sense that some darkness refused to be banished by daylight. That evening, under an oppressive sky that seemed to mimic my inner turmoil, I found myself once again by the pool. I sat at its edge in the stillness, the water perfectly calm as if hiding an immense secret beneath its surface. The night was unusually silent. Not even the usual chorus of crickets dared to break the stillness. I stared into the darkness, willing my eyes to adjust to the gloom, and almost immediately a familiar chill washed over me. For a fleeting moment, the pool shimmered anomalously, a ripple across its surface that gradually coalesced into a faint, spectral outline. I could barely make out a face, its features gaunt yet sorrowful, eyes pleading silently. It was as if the water had unlatched a door and allowed a tortured soul to peer back at me. I reached out to touch the water and recoiled as my fingers plunged into an inexplicable coldness. Not the gentle caress of cool water, but a searing chill that almost burned. A sound then emerged, a low murmur that wasn't there before, soft and first indistinct, then progressively louder. I sat motionless, transfixed by fear and fascination as that sound took the shape of a voice, layered with both longing and despair. It whispered the word once more, "Remember," in a tone that vibrated deep within my chest. I wasn't sure if I was hallucinating or if the memory of that night had finally manifested again in a physical form. My heart pounded as the voice seemed to echo off the walls of my mind, wrapping itself around my every thought. In that moment, I realized that what had begun on that fateful spring break was not a transient hallucination of youth, but perhaps an ancient, malevolent force that had attached itself to me, unwilling to let go. In subsequent days, I found myself increasingly isolated by this burden. Friends noticed my distant gaze during casual conversations and the way I would often fixate on reflective surfaces, as though expecting the ghostly face to emerge at any moment. I began to avoid crowded places, fearing that the pressure of others would drive the reprisal of that memory. The haunting presence of the sinister pool had become an inescapable shackle, each reflective moment in a mirror or a window carrying the specter of that sorrowful plea. I even tried to document my experiences, scribbling frantic entries in my journal, desperate to rationalize the terror. I wrote about the texture of that cold water, the sickly sweetness of fear that lingered in the air around the villa, and the unceasing refrain that haunted my every waking moment. One sleepless night, driven by a mix of desperation and the need for answers, I ventured into the villa's forgotten library. Dusty volumes lined heavy oak shelves, many of them records of local history and folklore. With trembling hands, I searched through brittle newspapers and faded manuscripts, piecing together fragments of stories long buried. I discovered chilling accounts of drownings and mysterious disappearances near that very lake, tales of souls lured to watery graves by an insatiable need to be remembered. There were whispers of a curse placed upon the waters centuries ago, a pact made in grief and sealed by the blood of those wronged by fate. I read of families torn apart by sudden losses, of young lovers vanishing beneath the moonlit surface, and of a presence described only as a remnant of eternal sorrow. The more I read, the more I became convinced that the sinister pool was more than a natural phenomenon. It was a repository of unacknowledged grief, a macabre reminder that those who died in ways too heartbreaking for the living would always demand remembrance. This revelation only deepened my torment. Every reflective surface in my life seemed now like a window into that haunted world. Every ripple in a puddle a subtle incantation urging me to remember the countless souls trapped beneath the surface. My dreams no longer offered respite. They became prolonged sequences of drowning in black water, desperate faces reaching upward, and a continuous loop of that one word, remember. I felt my mind fracturing under the weight of the curse. At times I would catch myself murmuring the word in my sleep, as if my very lips had been molded to carry the inscription of that night. In a moment of desperate clarity, I resolved to break the cycle. I sought the counsel of a local historian in the remote town, a grizzled man with sunken eyes and a voice worn by hardship. Over bitter coffee in a dimly lit diner, he recounted the legend of the lake with a gravity that chilled me. He told of how the sinister pool had once been part of a grand estate, where a series of tragic events had culminated in a massacre on the property. Survivors, racked with guilt and despair, claimed that the lake had been cursed by the collective sorrow of all those who had perished. They want to be remembered, he whispered, because in forgetting, you lose a part of them, and maybe a part of yourself. His words rang in my ears long after I left the diner, underscoring the inevitable truth that I was now a carrier of this burden. Returning to the villa that dusk, I felt both a compulsion and a revulsion to cast one final glance upon the pool. I waited until the stars peeked cautiously through the darkening sky, then crept outside with my journal tucked under my arm. The villa's gardens were silent, the only sound the occasional rustle of wind through dead branches. When I reached the pool, its surface lay undisturbed, as if resting under a tranquil facade. I sat on the damp grass and opened my journal, determined to record every tingling thought and every whispered memory in hopes of understanding the full enormity of what haunted me. I wrote of the spectral gaze that seemed to meet mine whenever I passed a reflective surface, of the persistent chill that seeped into my marrow, and of the unyielding command that had followed me since that fateful spring break. Remember. I wrote until my hand ached, the ink on the page becoming a silent testament to the internal torment that refused to subside. As I closed my journal, the wind shifted, and the pool stilled in a way that felt almost expectant. It was then that I experienced a final revelation. I stared intently at the dark water, and for one interminable moment, I saw not just a single sorrowful face, but a multitude of them, faces transiently emerging between the ripples, each one sharing a sorrow too great to name. I felt their pain like a collective heartbeat, a sorrow so vast that it overpowered ordinary human grief. The thought struck me with icy clarity. To forget those lost souls would be to betray them, to let their stories dissolve into oblivion. And so, with trembling resignation, I understood that my fate was sealed, not as a victim of this curse, but as its unwilling herald. I had been chosen to carry the memory of every tragedy, every hushed farewell, every desperate, unheard whisper from the dark depths. I rose from the pool's edge as the first light of dawn tinged the horizon with the promise of a new day. Yet, inside, I felt the oppressive weight of eternal remembrance. I knew that no amount of time or distance would ever purge me of that chilling command. Each reflective surface, every quiet ripple in water, would forever echo with the voices of the drowned, the sorrowful pleas of those who had never been laid to rest. Now, as I continue living with this hidden torment, I try to warn others in subtle ways. A glance, a passing comment, a hushed "remember" when the mood darkens. But I fear that the legacy of that sinister pool is not mine alone. It is an eternal curse, a living memory encoded in water and shadow, destined to follow me through every mirror and every darkened window until I join the chorus of the forgotten. The summer of that spring break remains a scar on my soul, a reminder that some secrets, once unveiled, refuse to fade, no matter how fervently one might wish to forget. And every time I catch my reflection in any still water, I see the unyielding eyes of that sorrowful multitude, silently urging, pleading, commanding me to remember forevermore. I spent weeks battling insomnia and creeping dread as the cursed memory of that night at the pool took root in every aspect of my life. Every time I passed a darkened window or caught the glint of a puddle in the rain, I was reminded of the spectral eyes and the desperate, echoing plea of remember. The haunting weight of that command seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, as though the pool had reached beyond the confines of the villa and seeped into my very soul. I began to withdraw from my friends and daily routines, living in a disjointed haze of paranoia and sorrow. Every quiet moment gifted me with intrusive flashbacks. I would see the tortured face in rippling water, or catch the faint sound of that incomprehensible chant when I closed my eyes. Desperate for some form of solace and understanding, I sought out anyone who could explain the inexplicable calamity that had invaded my spring break. In the small, dusty town near the villa, I tracked down an old caretaker of the property, a gaunt, taciturn man whose voice quavered when he recalled the past. Over bitter coffee in a dimly lit diner, he reluctantly warned me, "Some things are bound to these waters. Long ago, a tragedy was sealed here. A massacre, they say, and a curse was laid upon the pool by the grieving souls who never knew rest." His eyes were haunted, and as he spoke, I sensed the conviction of a man who had borne the weight of local legends for decades. He told me of a ritual passed down among a few elder residents, a desperate ceremony meant to appease the restless spirits. If you remember them, honor their memory, you might just calm the curse, he whispered. Yet even as he explained, his tone carried resignation, a belief that some curses cannot be undone, but only endured. Armed with his cryptic advice and my own mounting terror, I returned to the villa, a pilgrimage of sorts, to confront the source of my torment head-on. The evening crept in like a living thing, the sky bruised with deep purples and smoldering oranges, and I found myself drawn once more to the familiar spot by the pool. Now, every step toward that water was a negotiation between dread and determination. I approached the edge slowly, the night air now chill and unnervingly still. The pool lay like a seamless black mirror beneath the shroud of darkness, its surface undisturbed, as if challenging me to look and remember. Standing there, I almost felt a physical pressure, like invisible hands reaching for me from the depths. The sensations returned, an inexplicable prickling down my neck, a dread that coiled in the pit of my stomach. I knew I had to document this confrontation, so I retrieved my journal and recorder, determined to capture any sign of the spectral presence. I whispered into the recorder, recounting the sensations and recalling the voice that had haunted me. Remember. As if on cue, the surface of the water quavered with a delicate ripple, my recorder picking up a nearly imperceptible murmur beneath the gentle lapping of the pool. The same mournful intonation, layered with sorrow and a timeless lament. Time stretched on. I sat transfixed, my journal open in front of me while my hand trembled as I tried to capture in ink the ghostly images my mind conjured. In the watery blackness, I thought I saw multiple faces emerging and receding, a shifting mosaic of sorrowful, desperate expressions. At intervals, I could make out the gaunt visage from that night, a pleading look in eyes that spoke of centuries of lost hope. The voice, now both external and echoing in my memory, repeated softly in the darkness, "Remember, never forget." It was both a command and a lament, urging me to bear witness to the eternal grief that resided in that cursed water. The relentless repetition of that word seeped into my thoughts until I began to question what it truly meant. Was it a message for me alone, or was it an eternal litany meant for all who encountered this place? In my fevered state, overwhelmed by isolation and despair, I began to scribble frantic notes about the possibility that the pool was a repository for the souls of those who perished in unspeakable tragedy. Maybe every lifeless ripple carried with it the weight of a memory too horrible to let fade, a sorrow too infinite to erase. I scoured old records and local lore, finding only sparse fragments, tales of a long-forgotten massacre on the estate, rumors of lives tragically cut short by fate and neglect, and whispers that the pool had been built, or rather, cursed, over the remains of forgotten souls left to drown in their own despair. In the oppressive silence of that fateful night, marked by my vigil beside the pool, I felt the boundary between the living and the dead grow perilously thin. It was as if my own identity was beginning to merge with the tortured echoes in the water. In moments of stark terror, I contemplated if I was becoming both witness and vessel for a sorrow that had no end. At times I would catch my reflection, a gaunt, haunted figure whose eyes shimmered with the pool's melancholy, and wonder if I had already become part of that inexorable curse. I decided to try and perform the simple ritual that the old caretaker had described, a small, symbolic gesture to honor the lost and to appease their eternal yearning. Under the cloak of darkness, I returned to the pool with a single white candle, its flame trembling in the cold wind. I offered the flame as a symbol of remembrance, reciting a quiet, heartfelt plea. To those who have suffered and been forgotten, I honor you. Let your memory live on. I placed the candle at the edge of the pool, where the water lapped quietly against the stone, and sat in silence to watch its light dance on the dark surface. For a long while, nothing happened. I sat there in a state of anxious stillness, the only sound the soft hum of the night and the quiet lapping of water against ancient stone. But gradually, the pool's surface began to shudder, gently at first, then more insistently, as if stirred by an unseen current. The candle's flame flickered and merged with fleeting reflections. In that shifting moment, I saw it, a face not my own, emerging in the water's undulations with eyes that glowed with a tempest of unbearable grief and longing. The face seemed to hold a silent story of agony, pleading in its eyes for acknowledgement, for release from an unending cycle of despair. I felt that my heart was not solely my own, that it had become attuned to a rhythm older than time, a sorrow that transcended the mortal coil. A strange calm descended over me then, as if in that moment the burden of remembrance was shared between the living and the dead. The whisper of that solitary word no longer carried an air of menace, Instead, it resonated as a solemn imperative, a reminder that forgetting was a disservice, a betrayal of untold tragedies. And yet, even as I yearned to let go of the incessant echo in my mind, I understood that this experience had changed me irrevocably. I could no longer simply go about my daily routine without feeling the lingering tendrils of the pool's curse wrapping around my thoughts. In the following days, I became increasingly reclusive. Social gatherings felt hollow, and every reflective surface in my path, whether a window, a mirror, or even the glimmer on a puddle after rain, served as an incessant reminder of that spectral plea. Nightmares plagued me, visions of watery faces and ghostly voices merging with the flicker of candlelight. Attempts to explain the phenomena to my friends were met with sympathy and disbelief in equal measure. They tried to convince me that it was all a trick of the mind, memories distorted by trauma and alcohol. But deep inside, I knew that the pool had opened a door that could never be closed. I began to wonder if the curse was not meant to be escaped, but rather to be shared. What if those lost souls were reaching out, not solely for me, but for all of us who dared to recall their lives? In a moment of desperate introspection, I realized that the relentless remember was not a burden placed on me by a cruel fate. It was an invitation to bear witness, a chance to ensure that their pain would not be silenced by the passage of time. That recognition came with a terrible cost. The curse had become part of who I was, and abandoning it meant erasing a history steeped in sorrow and injustice. I slowly resolved to confront my fate rather than run from it. I returned to the villa often, sitting by the pool well into the early hours of the morning, letting the weight of its memories seep into me. I recorded my thoughts in painstaking detail, determined to pen an account that might help others understand the delicate balance between remembrance and oblivion. Each sentence was laced with the raw intensity of my fear and the quiet hope that by acknowledging the past, I might somehow alleviate its ceaseless burden. I started to share fragments of my story in cautious whispers among those who would listen, urging them to remember not just the tragedies of the past, but the lessons learned from them, a call to honor every life that had slipped beneath the surface without a proper farewell. Yet, even as I labored to document my ordeal, I couldn't shake the growing disquiet that perhaps one day the pool's call would grow louder, more insistent. In the silent churn of every dark reflection, I feared that the boundary between memory and madness might finally dissolve. There were nights when I would wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of that ghostly plea still ringing in my ears, and I would wonder if I was truly the guardian of these sorrowful memories, or merely an unwilling vessel doomed to repeat the cycle of grief. Now, nearly a year later, I still see the ripple of that dark water on stormy nights, still hear the sorrowful murmur when I least expect it, a constant reminder that some forces, once awakened, never truly rest. The sinister pool has become both a part of me and a warning to all who seek careless abandon in moments of frivolous delight. For beneath its tranquil surface lies an enduring testament to the tragedies of the past, a legacy forged in grief that insists on being remembered, no matter how hard you try to forget. I continue to live with this burden, striving to honor each lost soul by keeping their memory alive in every word I write, every conversation I start about the cost of forgetting, and in every reflective glimmer, whether in a window or a quietly rippling pond on a rainy day, I see the faces of those who once cried out in silence, a chorus of souls whose mournful voices will echo in the depths of my heart until the end of my days. Their legacy is etched in every droplet that falls from the dark heavens, a perpetual reminder that some tragedies live on, demanding that we never, ever forget. The Forgotten Lighthouse. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the world, its silhouette jagged against the stormy sky. It was a relic of another time, abandoned and forgotten, perched on a crumbling cliff that overlooked the churning sea. My friends and I had heard about it from a local bartender during our spring break trip to a coastal town that seemed to exist in a perpetual state of twilight. "Don't go near it," he had warned, his voice low and serious. People who go there don't come back the same, if they come back at all. Naturally, we laughed it off. We were young, invincible, and eager for adventure. The idea of exploring a haunted lighthouse was too tempting to resist. We set out the next morning, the 5 of us crammed into a beat-up Jeep that groaned with every mile. The road to the lighthouse was barely a road at all, just a narrow, winding path carved into the cliffs, with sheer drops on one side and dense, gnarled trees on the other. The air grew colder as we climbed, and the sky darkened, as if the world itself was trying to warn us away. By the time we reached the lighthouse, the sun had disappeared behind a wall of thick, gray clouds, and the wind howled like a living thing. The lighthouse was even more imposing up close. Its once white walls were streaked with grime and moss, and its windows were shattered, jagged shards of glass clinging to the frames like broken teeth. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking on rusted hinges as the wind pushed against it. We hesitated for a moment, the weight of the place pressing down on us. But then Tyler, always the bravest, or the most reckless, pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Come on," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "It's just an old building." The interior was worse than I had imagined. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of salt and decay. The walls were covered in peeling paint and strange, dark stains that seemed to pulse in the dim light. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, rotting wood, and what looked like the remains of birds or small animals. A spiral staircase wound its way up the center of the lighthouse, disappearing into the shadows above. "Let's check out the top," Rachel suggested, her voice trembling slightly. "The view's probably amazing." We climbed the staircase slowly, the metal groaning under our weight. The higher we went, the darker it became, until the only light came from the faint glow of our flashlights. The air grew colder, and the wind seemed to seep through the walls, carrying with it a low, mournful sound that could have been the wind or something else. By the time we reached the top, I was shivering, though whether from the cold or fear, I couldn't say. The lantern room was a circular space with glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the sea and the cliffs below, or at least it should have. The glass was so dirty and fogged that we could barely see out, and the room itself was filled with an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. In the center of the room stood the remains of the old lantern, its metal frame twisted and corroded. Around it, etched into the floor, was a series of strange symbols that none of us could decipher. They seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them, as if they were alive. "What the hell is this?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. No one answered. We stood there in silence, the weight of the place pressing down on us, until Tyler broke the spell. "It's just some old graffiti," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Come on, let's head back down." As we turned to leave, the door to the lantern room slammed shut with a deafening crash. We froze, our flashlights darting to the door, but there was no one there. The wind howled louder, and the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening and twisting around us. And then we heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the lighthouse. It was a voice, though not like any voice I had ever heard. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, the words harsh and guttural, but the tone was unmistakable: anger, despair, and a deep, consuming hunger. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, their lines pulsing with a sickly green light. The air grew colder still, and I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the room itself was closing in on us. "We need to get out of here," Rachel said, her voice shaking. But the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard we pushed or pulled, it remained firmly shut, as if held in place by some unseen force. The voice grew louder, the words coming faster now, and the symbols on the floor began to shift and writhe, their light growing brighter. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. And then, in the center of the room, something began to take shape. It was a shadow at first, a dark, amorphous mass that seemed to suck the light from the room. But as it grew, it began to take on a more defined form. A figure, tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a face that was little more than a void. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were pinpricks of light that burned with an intensity that made me want to look away but held me captive. The figure moved toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. The voice grew louder still, the words now a deafening roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt a hand grab mine, Mia's, and she pulled me toward the door. "We have to get out," she screamed, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The figure froze, its head tilted as if listening to something we couldn't hear. The symbols on the floor dimmed, their light fading until they were nothing more than faint marks on the floor. The door creaked open, and the wind rushed in, carrying with it the salty tang of the sea. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran, stumbling down the spiral staircase, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we fled. The lighthouse seemed to groan and shudder around us, the walls closing in, the air thick with the scent of salt and decay. When we burst out into the open air, the storm had broken. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly overhead, and the wind had died down to a gentle breeze. The lighthouse stood silent and still behind us, its dark silhouette a stark contrast against the night sky. We didn't speak as we climbed into the Jeep and drove away, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped down the winding road. We never talked about what happened that night. Not really. Tyler tried to laugh it off, calling it a shared hallucination brought on by the storm and the creepy atmosphere. But I knew better. I could see it in their eyes, the same haunted look I saw in my own reflection. We had seen something in that lighthouse, something that defied explanation, something that would stay with us forever. Even now, years later, I can still hear that voice in my dreams, speaking in that guttural, incomprehensible language. I can still see those symbols, shifting and writhing in the dim light, and the figure that emerged from the shadows, its eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce my very soul. And I know, deep down, that the lighthouse is still there, standing at the edge of the world, waiting for the next group of foolish adventurers to stumble into its grasp. The cabin beneath the pines. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a spring break spent far from the chaos of crowded beaches and drunken revelry. My friends and I, 6 of us in total, had rented a cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines. The listing had promised solitude, fresh air, and a chance to reconnect with nature. What it didn't mention was the cabin's history or the horrors that waited for us beneath the forest canopy. The drive up was uneventful, the kind of road trip filled with bad music, cheap snacks, and laughter that echoed through the car. As we turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew colder, and the GPS lost its signal, leaving us to navigate by the vague directions provided by the rental owner. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. The cabin itself was rustic but charming, with a wraparound porch and a stone fireplace. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and something faintly metallic. The walls were adorned with old photographs and hunting trophies, their glassy eyes catching the flicker of our flashlights as we explored. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and only a single landline phone mounted on the wall in the kitchen. It was perfect, or so we thought. That first night, we built a fire in the hearth and settled in with board games and bottles of wine. The forest outside was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl, a soothing backdrop to our laughter and conversation. But as the hours passed, the mood began to shift. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room, and the forest grew unnervingly quiet. It was Mia who first noticed it, the absence of sound. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We paused, listening intently, but there was nothing. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin. We laughed it off, blaming the wine and our overactive imaginations. But the unease lingered. As we prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of something through the window, a flicker of movement among the trees. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I told myself it was just a deer or a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next morning, we decided to explore the woods. The air was crisp and cold, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams. We followed a narrow trail that wound its way deeper into the forest, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. It was beautiful, almost serene, but there was an undercurrent of unease that none of us could ignore. The trees seemed to loom closer the further we went, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And then we found it. The clearing was small, barely more than a break in the trees, but it felt wrong. The air was colder here, and the sunlight seemed to dim as we stepped into the space. In the center of the clearing stood a stone well, its edges worn smooth by time. The stones were dark and damp, and the opening gaped like a mouth, black and yawning. Around the well the ground was bare, the moss and leaves giving way to hard-packed earth. There were no signs of animals, no tracks or droppings, as if the clearing was a place even the wildlife avoided. Tyler, ever the daredevil, approached the well and peered inside. "It's just a hole," he said, his voice echoing faintly. He picked up a rock and dropped it in, but we never heard it hit the bottom. "That's weird," he muttered, stepping back. The rest of us kept our distance, an unspoken agreement that whatever lay at the bottom of that well was better left undisturbed. That night the silence returned, heavier than before. The fire in the hearth seemed to struggle against the darkness, its light barely reaching the corners of the room. As we sat in uneasy silence, the landline phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the stillness like a knife. We stared at it, none of us moving to answer. The phone rang again and again, until finally Mia picked it up. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling. There was no response, just a faint rhythmic sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, and far too close. Mia slammed the phone down, her face pale. "It was nothing," she said, but her voice betrayed her fear. We tried to laugh it off, to convince ourselves it was just a prank or a crossed line, but the unease was palpable. That night I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling as the silence pressed in around me. And then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. It was subtle at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to be coming from all around me. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw a shadow move across the room. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but it was there. The next morning, we decided to leave. The unease had grown into full-blown fear, and none of us wanted to spend another night in the cabin. But when we tried to start the Jeep, the engine sputtered and died. We checked the gas tank, the battery, everything we could think of, but the car refused to start. We were stranded. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees loomed taller, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant snap of a branch. We stayed close to the cabin, too afraid to venture far, but the sense of being watched never left us. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. It came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as if the cabin itself was alive. And then the whispers began, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from just beyond the edge of hearing. We huddled together in the living room, the fire burning low as the sounds grew louder, more distinct. The whispers turned into voices, guttural and angry, speaking in a language none of us could understand. And then the door slammed open. The wind rushed in, extinguishing the fire and plunging the room into darkness. In the faint light of our flashlights, we saw them. Figures, tall and thin, their faces obscured by shadows. They moved with unnatural grace, their limbs jerking and twisting as they advanced toward us. We screamed, scrambling to our feet and running for the back door. We burst out into the night, the cold air biting at our skin as we fled into the forest. We ran blindly, the trees closing in around us, the ground uneven and treacherous. The figures followed, their movements silent and relentless. I could hear the others behind me, their breaths ragged and panicked, but I didn't dare look back. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees forming an endless maze that offered no escape. And then I tripped. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs, and for a moment I couldn't move. When I looked up, I saw them, standing in a circle around me, their faces still hidden, their bodies swaying as if caught in an unseen current. One of them stepped forward, its hand reaching out, and I felt a cold, suffocating pressure wrap around me. The last thing I heard before everything went black was a single word, whispered in a voice that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Stay. When I woke, I was alone. The forest was silent, the cabin nowhere in sight. I stumbled through the trees, my mind racing until I found the road. A passing car picked me up, the driver's face a mask of concern as I babbled incoherently about what had happened. I never saw my friends again. The police searched the area but found no trace of them or the cabin. It was as if they had never existed. The Black Sun Motel. I never imagined that a simple detour on a spring break road trip could lead to a nightmare. Our plan had been simple: take a cross-country drive, stop at roadside attractions for goofy selfies, and spend one wild night at a quirky motel that promised retro charm along a desolate highway in the middle of nowhere. I was the designated driver for a group of 5 college friends, all eager for a break from the monotony of academic life. We had heard rumors about the Black Sun Motel, a faded relic from another era perched on the outskirts of a long-forgotten town, and we decided that its supposed eccentricity would be the perfect backdrop for an unforgettable night. We had driven for hours, the highway stretching like a battered ribbon through barren fields and crumbling structures. As dusk approached, the sun dipped low, casting long, distorted shadows over abandoned gas stations and rusted billboards. When we finally saw the flicker of neon from the motel's sign, a dim, sputtering Black Sun Motel in chipped letters, we exchanged amused glances, eager to see what secrets this relic might hold. The motel was hardly inviting. Its facade was a patchwork of peeling paint and faded advertising slogans that once boasted of endless vacations and roadside wonders. The parking lot was littered with rusted cars and weathered debris, and a cold wind stirred the fallen leaves as if whispering warnings. Despite the uneasy feeling that gnawed at the edges of our excitement, we pulled up and unloaded our bags. The building itself was a squat, 2-story affair with narrow windows and a single, flickering light in the doorway. We checked in at the front desk, where a gaunt, silvery man in a threadbare uniform greeted us with a vacant smile. His eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to follow us as we moved about, and his rasping voice hardly masked a hint of disquiet when he mumbled, "Enjoy your stay. And remember, the past never truly dies here." At first, we took little notice. The motel's interior was dated but serviceable. A lobby with a dusty sofa and a flickering ceiling fan. Hallways dimly lit by neon bulbs that hummed with a low static sound, and rooms that reeked faintly of mildew and old cigarette smoke. Our room was on the 2nd floor, its small balcony offering a narrow view of the cracked pavement below and a glimpse of the dark, empty lot beyond. Laughter and the clamor of our arrival soon filled the space as we unpacked and settled in to what we assumed would be an inconsequential night of recklessness. That first night unfolded in a haze of cheap beer, loud music from our portable speaker, and careless rumors exchanged under the flickering light of street lamps. We shared stories of wild parties and daring escapades, unaware that the motel itself was slowly revealing its sinister nature. Lying on the threadbare carpet and staring up at the stained ceiling, I began to feel an inexplicable chill, as if the room's stagnant air were laced with unseen eyes watching every move. I dismissed it as the residual effect of fear and the onset of late hours. Later, as the night deepened, I stepped onto the balcony to catch a breath of slightly cooler air. The world below was silent, the only sound a distant hum of wind on asphalt. It was then that I noticed something odd in the alley adjacent to the motel, a figure standing motionless at the far end, half obscured by shadow. It wasn't moving, and the darkness hid its features, but it was there, an inexplicable shape that set my nerves on edge. I squinted into the gloom, feeling uncertain whether it was a trick of the light or a real person. I decided to mention it when I rejoined my friends on the motel's back porch, but when I mentioned it, they only laughed nervously, attributing my unease to the effects of too much adrenaline and too little sleep. Around midnight, I returned inside, and while most of my friends had already lapsed into a drunken stupor, I wandered the narrow corridors of the motel, driven by a strange compulsion to explore. The hallway stretched before me, the patterned carpet worn thin in patches, and the rooms around me exuded a lingering odor of decay. As I passed one room, I noticed that the door was ajar. A faint light spilled into the dark hallway, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic tapping like a slow heartbeat. The sight made my skin crawl, and I instinctively stepped back, heart hammering in my chest. I told myself I was imagining things, yet when I reached for the door handle, a sudden rush of icy wind burst from the room, extinguishing the weak light and leaving nothing but oppressive darkness. I hurried away, deciding that some mysteries were best left unexplored. I eventually made my way back to our room, where, over the course of the remaining hours of the night, the murmur of disembodied voices began to infiltrate my thoughts. I heard soft whispers when I closed my eyes, a repetitive low chant, "Remember, remember." The words, laced with a melancholic timbre, recurred in a loop that I couldn't shake off. Every moment of silence seemed to echo with that word. Sleep, when it finally came, was fraught with restless dreams. I saw fleeting images of a woman in tattered clothing standing in a dim corridor, her eyes long and sorrowful, and I felt as if my own face in the mirror was gradually fading, replaced by something gaunt and unrecognizable. Morning was a bitter, uneasy reprieve. We gathered in the cramped dining area for breakfast, a meager offering of stale bread and weak coffee, and shared our fragmented recollections of the night. While most of us tried to brush off the inexplicable sensations as the residue of too much alcohol and too many late-night ghost stories, a few of us exchanged quiet, uneasy looks. I recalled the gaunt receptionist's cryptic words and the disconcerting message scrawled on the back of the old registration book, "The past is never dead." It was as if the motel itself was urging us not to forget what had transpired within its walls. The day progressed in a sluggish, disoriented haze. The sun came up over an empty parking lot, casting long shadows behind the decrepit building. I noticed that the usual hum of the highway had died down significantly, replaced by an almost eerie quiet that seemed to permeate the area. Driving away in the beat-up car, we expected that distance and daylight might wash away the night's terrors. But as I sat in the back seat, I found that the feeling of being watched, of the past reaching out to claim me, clung like a second skin. Every reflective surface, a rear-view mirror, an office window passed along the highway, seemed to momentarily display a face I did not recognize, gaunt, hollow, and laden with unspeakable sorrow. In the following days, the memory of the Black Sun Motel proved impossible to erase. We tried to return to normal routines, but each passing moment was marred by subtle reminders of that cursed place. I began noticing unsettling patterns, sudden drafts in closed rooms, mirrors that flickered with brief, ghostly images, and strange scratches on surfaces that looked like desperate claw marks. At night, when I lay awake, I could almost hear faint, mournful chanting in a language I couldn't understand, as if the motel was reciting a litany to exorcise its dark past. Sleep was elusive, and the boundaries between waking life and haunting dreams blurred. Driven by a need for closure, I found myself returning, alone, to the still dilapidated motel several months later. I rationalized the journey with an academic curiosity, a desire to uncover the building's history, to understand the events that had cursed it. I spent hours in local archives and dusty libraries in the nearby town, piecing together half-forgotten newspaper clippings and death notices referring to tragedies that had once haunted the motel. One article spoke of a family whose sudden disappearance on a stormy night had left the community gripped with horror. Another recounted the mysterious death of a traveling salesman who had checked in, only to vanish without a trace from his room. Every record hinted at a legacy of sorrow and inexplicable loss that festered behind the motel's crumbling facade. Armed with these fragments of history and a stubborn need to confront my lingering nightmares, I returned to the Black Sun Motel once more. The building was still there, weathered and resolute against the ravages of time. In the now quiet parking lot, I parked my car and slowly approached the front door. The reception desk was abandoned, its ledger pages scattered, and the gaunt receptionist was nowhere in sight. I felt as if I had stepped into a time warp, a place where time and memory coalesced into a suffocating miasma of despair. Inside, every creak and groan of the aging building reverberated like a mournful dirge. I walked through the hallways, paying particular attention to the room where I had once heard that soft tapping and seen that elusive light. I found the door still slightly ajar, and I pushed it open. The room was empty and cold, the air heavy with the scent of old regrets. On the wall hung a faded photograph, its edges curling and discolored. It depicted a family, smiling faces that now seemed eerie in their faded joy. And on the back, in a trembling script, was written, "Remember." The word was scrawled repeatedly, a mantra of grief and loneliness. I couldn't help but feel that the very act of ignoring these messages would be a betrayal, a denial of the lives that had once populated this forsaken place. In that moment, I resolved to document everything, not as a means of sensationalism, but as a ritual of remembrance. I took my notebook and began writing, describing in painstaking detail every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind that seemed to carry distant voices. I recorded the melancholy of the faded photograph, the inexplicable chill that clung even to stale indoor air. The more I wrote, the more I felt an uneasy solidarity with the ghosts of the past, an understanding that to forget was to diminish their suffering. As dusk fell once more over the deserted motel, I lapsed into a half-watchfulness, half-dream state in an abandoned room. The silence was punctuated only by the soft, repetitive creaks of the building settling in the cool evening air, and then, in the dim glow of a single, sputtering light bulb, I heard it, a barely audible murmur that swelled into something unmistakable, a voice that repeated the word "remember" again and again, as if chanting a sorrowful incantation. I rose from my bed with a dread that chilled me to the bone, my heart pounding in tandem with that relentless refrain. I followed the sound down a narrow, dark corridor, my flashlight beam jittering over stained walls and old, peeling wallpaper. The murmuring led to a door that I'd never noticed before, its surface obscured by years of dust. With trembling hands, I pushed it open to reveal a small, forgotten room that looked like a caretaker's office. On a desk lay a single ledger, its pages brittle and yellowed with age, and scattered across it were faded photographs of unknown people. Their eyes looked sad, haunted by mysteries too deep to comprehend. In the margin of one page, I saw a handwritten note in spidery ink. They must be remembered, for only then will the shadows rest. At that precise moment, a gust of wind swept through the room, flipping the pages of the ledger wildly, as if animated by a sorrow that would not break free. The sound of the pages rustling melded with the incessant chant in the hallway, creating a chorus of desperation that was both heartbreaking and profoundly terrifying. I felt my vision blur as I struggled to hold on to consciousness, torn between the compulsion to record every detail and a visceral fear that I was becoming ensnared in the very curse I sought to understand. I managed to stagger back into the corridor, my mind reeling from the onslaught of emotions and inexplicable visions. a mosaic of memories and voices from a past that refused to be forgotten. The hotel, the family from the photograph, the ledger's haunting plea, all wove together into an overwhelming tapestry of grief. I knew then that my return to the motel was not a mere act of investigation. It was a desperate, inescapable pilgrimage. The Black Sun Motel had marked me, leaving an indelible imprint upon my soul, a force that demanded that every sorrowful story, every lost life, be remembered. In the weeks that followed, I tried to resume normal life, but the echoes of that place followed me relentlessly. In the quiet of long nights, between the hum of everyday routines, I would catch glimpses of the motel's decaying sign, the sorrowful faces in every mirror, and the unyielding command whispered on the wind. Remember. I attempted therapy and tried writing down my experiences as a means to exorcise the relentless shadows. Yet every reflection carried with it the cold certainty of the past, a past that refused to be relegated to memory alone. I now understand that some curses are not active malevolence seeping through a haunted wall. They are the quiet persistence of grief, an unhealed wound left by loss and neglect. The Black Sun Motel, with its broken sign and abandoned halls, is not merely a relic of a bygone era. It is an eternal testament to every soul forgotten, every memory left to fester in the cold darkness of time. And while I've tried to move forward, there are moments when I see that same gaunt face in a crowded mirror, or hear that same mournful word on a breeze. I share my story not as a thrill seeker recounting urban legends, but as someone who has been irrevocably changed. The Black Sun Motel taught me that forgetting is a form of violence, against the dead, against the living, and against ourselves. Now, every time I pause before a reflective surface or feel the cold shimmer of a dark road at night, I am reminded there are places in this world where sorrow lingers, where the past is never fully buried, and where the ghosts of lost lives demand one simple, inexorable act: to remember. The Devil's Den. Spring break always promised the thrill of escape, a chance to leave behind the pressures of exams, deadlines, and the monotonous routine of campus life. But nothing could have prepared us for what awaited in the barren expanse of the Nevada desert. We were a ragtag group of college friends, fueled by reckless abandon and the hope of endless nights under a starlit sky. The plan was simple: pack into an old rental van, follow a scarcely marked highway, and spend a few days at a remote RV park famed for its dive bar known ominously as the Devil's Den. The name itself had a way of stirring hushed whispers among locals, but we, intoxicated by youthful bravado, dismissed it as nothing more than a quirky moniker. The drive was long and winding. The backbone of the desert unfurled before us in endless shades of rust and ochre, punctuated by lonely signposts and abandoned service stations that crumbled with the weight of years. As dusk approached, the sky transformed into a canvas of bruised purples and fiery oranges. The van's headlights struggled against the creeping darkness, illuminating cracks in the lengthy asphalt and dust swirling in the dry wind. Every mile took us deeper into a world that, while desolate and unforgiving, held an eerie allure, a foretaste of something ancient and forlorn. When we finally arrived, the RV park was little more than a scattering of outdated trailers and a solitary, dilapidated building that housed the Devil's Den bar. The entire place seemed to exist in a state of suspended decay, as though it had been abandoned long ago, yet inexplicably maintained by forces unknown. The few RVs that still populated the park were parked in uneven rows between rusted picnic tables and overgrown patches of scrub. A solitary neon sign, its once bright letters now flickering erratically, welcomed guests with a simple message: "Welcome to the Devil's Den." There was a spectral quality to the welcome, like a plea from beyond, to remember what had been lost here. That first night, the desert offered no relief from the oppressive heat as we set up our makeshift campsite under a vast, starlit sky The air shimmered with the residual warmth of the day, and a heavy silence fell as the festivities began. We laughed, swapped tales of wild parties and daredevil escapades, and raised our drinks to good fortune. Beneath it all, though, there lurked a disquieting sensation, as if the very ground beneath us, cracked and parched by relentless sun, held memories of unspeakable sorrow and regret. Later that evening, after we'd settled into our respective RVs and ventured to the Devil's Den for a round of drinks, I found myself wandering far from the raucous laughter and clatter of glass in the dive bar, drawn inexplicably toward the perimeter of the park. The bar itself was a relic, its wooden sign battered by wind and time, its neon lights casting erratic glows on peeling walls. Through a haze of cheap whiskey and boisterous college chatter, I caught sight of something that shouldn't belong, a lone figure moving slowly in the periphery of a badly lit dirt path. At first it appeared to be a drifter, but closer inspection revealed a pallor that suggested something other than human life. The figure was drawn in sharp relief against the shimmering horizon, its movements too deliberate, too silent. Though I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine, I pressed on, telling myself that exhaustion and alcohol were playing tricks on my mind. Even back at the bar, amidst the clamor and laughter, an undercurrent of unease permeated the atmosphere. Conversations ceased abruptly when an unfamiliar gust rattled the windows, and my companions exchanged uneasy glances as if silently questioning whether that figure had followed us. One of them, a wiry young man named Darren, later confided in a low voice that he had seen something moving among the trailers, a dark shape lurking in the corners where the light never penetrated. The tales of the local bartender, once dismissed, now crept slowly back into the conversation. Whispers of a curse were shared in half-jest, that those who stayed too long in this forsaken park would eventually find that the desert never truly let them leave, that memories of lost souls demanded to be acknowledged. The next night, as the desert grew cooler under the influence of a sudden breeze that rippled across the cracked earth, we all gathered for another round at the Devil's Den. This time, however, the atmosphere was palpably different. The neon sign flickered incessantly, as though trying desperately to send a message. Shadows in the bar's dim corners lengthened unnaturally, growing distorted until they seemed to take on shapes that twisted in silent agony. I distinctly heard a voice, a low murmur, carried on the wind outside, repeating a single word that sent shivers racing along my spine. Remember! It was barely audible over the background music, yet it resonated with an almost unbearable weight. I looked around at my friends. Darren's eyes were wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. Sarah, normally so confident, clutched her drink with trembling hands, and even Darren, always the skeptic, seemed silenced by an invisible force. After the rounds, we left the bar in a haze of numbed terror and stumbled out into a desert night that felt oppressive and stifling. The RV park, lit only by sporadic flickers of failing neon, took on a ghostly quality as long shadows stretched and merged. I found myself walking toward the same dim dirt path where I'd seen that mysterious figure. This time, I was determined to find answers. I moved cautiously, every crunch of gravel underfoot a heartbeat in the stillness. The wind whispered through the saguaro-like cacti and over sun-cracked stone formations, carrying with it a lament that felt both desperate and ancient. As I rounded a bend, I saw it again, a pale figure, almost translucent in the weak beam of a distant street lamp. It stood motionless a short distance away, its eyes dark hollows that seemed to draw in the sparse light. I froze as the figure slowly raised a hand, as if beckoning me forward, and then an overwhelming cry, whether from the figure or from deep within my own psyche, made me flee in terror, my heart pounding as I sprinted back to the relative safety of our RV. That night, sleep was elusive. In the silence of my cramped sleeping space, I lay awake, ears straining for even the faintest sound. Outside, the wind moaned like a wounded thing, and in that mournful cadence, I was certain I could hear the whispered refrain of, "Remember." Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the spectral figure again, its outstretched hand, its hollow eyes burning with a sorrow that transcended fear. I recalled the bartender's warning, the subtle insistence that those who lingered in the Devil's Den would find the desert's curse seeping into every fiber of their being. And I knew then that something had indeed latched onto this place. Something ancient, something that fed on the memories and regrets of those who dared come here for a brief taste of reckless freedom. In the following days, our merriment turned to unspoken dread. While we attempted to salvage the rest of our spring break by engaging in the usual antics, rushing from one roadside attraction to another, laughing off our previous encounters as nothing more than illusions of a sun-soaked mind, the memory of that looming presence haunted us relentlessly. The desert, vast and indifferent, seemed to conspire against us. We passed deserted gas stations where graffiti warned "Never Forget," scrawled hurriedly in red, and roadside billboards for long-closed establishments bore the faint image of a gaunt face staring back at us. At night, even as we tried to sleep in our van parked at an isolated rest stop, every sound, the rustle of wind in dry grass, the distant creak of old metal, became a reminder that the curse of the Devil's Den was following us. Things took a darker turn on the third night. Darren, who had been increasingly obsessed with deciphering the strange messages we encountered, vanished without a trace while we were out collecting firewood. One moment he was there, joking nervously about ghost stories, and the next, he was gone. We searched frantically along the dusty road and in the small, barren clusters of scrubland, but there was no sign of him. Only inexplicable tracks that seemed to lead nowhere, half-formed impressions in the sand that dissolved under the relentless wind. The disappearance shattered whatever semblance of normalcy we had left, and fear turned our camaraderie into a desperate struggle for survival. That same night, as the others huddled together, I was drawn once more to the roadside. I drove the van slowly, seeking any sign of Darren or an explanation for our mounting terror. As I passed a cluster of abandoned motels and dilapidated gas stations, the neon lights of a flickering sign caught my eye, a sign that read simply, "Remember." The words seemed to pulse with an eerie intensity, as though it were the heartbeat of the desert itself. I felt an inexplicable pull, and for a fleeting moment, I considered following it. But the weight of recent events quickly snapped me back to reality. I continued driving, though part of me knew that this curse was far from something that could be shrugged off by distance or speed. By the final day of our trip, we were a broken group, shadowed by losses and haunted by visions that refused to vanish in the harsh light of day. The desert morning was quiet, unnaturally so, a silence so complete it pressed against every window of the van. We packed our meager belongings with shaking hands, eager to leave behind the Devil's Den and its lingering curse. As we drove away, I leaned out the window for one last look. In the distance, across the barren stretch of cracked earth and under an oppressively pale sky, I could just make out the shape of that lonely RV park and the dilapidated building that housed the dive bar. And I saw it, a figure standing in the glare of the setting sun, its arms outstretched in futile welcome or desperate warning. Its face was masked in shadow, but the message was undeniable. Even as the van's taillights disappeared down the deserted highway, the whispered refrain echoed in my mind, a ceaseless, mournful command. Remember. Even now, years later, I have tried to piece together the memory of that cursed trip. I scour old photographs for a glimpse of Darren's smile. I drive along endless stretches of highway hoping to catch a glimpse of a ghostly figure. And at night, when the desert wind howls through my apartment window, I swear I can hear that distant, sorrowful whisper laughing in the darkness. The Devil's Den, with its eerie neon sign and shadowed passengers, remains etched into my soul, a dark reminder that some curses are as eternal and unyielding as the desert itself. And no matter how far I run or how many miles I cover, the desert's spectral hand always seems to reach out, whispering again and again with a voice that chills the very marrow of my bones. Remember. The bleak coast. I never expected that a spring break boat trip would plunge me into a waking nightmare. Yet, as I sit here recounting the events that forever altered my perception of the sea, I wonder if what happened along that remote stretch of the Maine coast was truly a product of our overactive imaginations or the relentless grasp of something otherworldly. My group of friends, Alex, Becky, Carter, Diana, and I, had planned the expedition with the promise of salty winds, carefree laughter, and the intoxicating freedom of open water. We rented an old motorboat, the Wanderer, and set sail from a busy harbor with dreams of isolation, adventure, and perhaps even a bit of peaceful reflection away from the everyday chaos. At first, the day unfolded like any other perfect summer escape. The sun blazed high in a flawlessly blue sky, and the gentle rocking of the boat lulled us into a state of blissful camaraderie. We joked, took turns steering, and idly scanned the horizon as gulls wheeled lazily overhead. Yet as we ventured farther from the familiar coastline, an unusual hush began to settle over the water. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the hull was gradually eclipsed by a disquieting silence. I remember glancing around at my friends, Alex's smile starting to falter, Becky's gaze lingering on the seemingly endless, darkening distance, and sensing that we were entering a place untouched by time where nature itself held its breath. Late in the afternoon, as the sun leaned toward the horizon, we spotted something odd on the water. Off to our starboard side, emerging from a haze of mist that had begun to form despite the warmth, was a jagged outline of a rocky outcrop. It was not marked on any of our charts, and local lore, as later discovered, spoke of a hidden cove known only to a few as the Bleak Coast, a place where fog lingers long after sunset, and where the sea seems to remember ancient sorrows. Intrigued and emboldened by youth, we steered the Wanderer toward that enigmatic formation, eager for a taste of mystery. As we approached the coast, the water grew choppier, and a metallic tang hung in the air. The coastline here was rugged. Sharp cliffs jutted out over cold, dark water, and the waves crashed relentlessly against narrow coves. The hidden cove revealed itself in a momentary clearing in the mist, a secluded bay cradled by steep, weather-beaten rocks. Intrigued, we dropped anchor and clambered aboard a small dinghy to explore the shoreline. The beach was a desolate expanse of black pebbles and tangled seaweed under a sky turned abruptly overcast. I remember the wind there as a biting force that seemed to whisper in a language older than time. The silence was nearly absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a lone gull and the murmur of the tide. As we wandered along the rocky edge, a chill seeped into my bones despite the lingering heat. Every step felt as though we were trespassing in a place that nature herself had long forsaken. My heart pounded when I noticed peculiar symbols etched into weathered stones scattered along the shoreline. At first, I assumed they were the work of vandals or remnants of forgotten settlers, but there was something unsettling in the precision of the carvings, swirling lines and cryptic marks arranged in intricate patterns that evoked a sense of ritual, of forbidden knowledge. We pressed on, curiosity battling our growing apprehension, and soon discovered the shattered remains of a small wooden rowboat tangled in seaweed and driftwood. Its paint was peeling in sickly shades, and inside the boat lay remnants of what appeared to be personal belongings: a rusted pocket watch, a muddy bundle of letters, and a faded photograph showing a group of sailors at the dock, their faces twisted in expressions of desperate sorrow. I felt an inexplicable weight as I picked up the photograph. There was something in the hollow eyes of the men, something that spoke of loss and betrayal, the unmistakable aura of souls condemned to tragedy. As dusk settled over the cove, an oppressive fog began to roll in, swallowing the coastline and muting the vibrant colors of sunset into a monochrome gloom. We returned to the Wanderer, each of us silently wrestling with a sense of foreboding that the day had uncovered. The engine roared to life as we set sail, but the boat's progress was slow, as if the water itself conspired to hold us. That night, anchored in the eerie confines of the hidden cove, we gathered on deck beneath a sickly crescent moon. The air was thick with salt and damp decay, and an unnerving quiet prevailed that no amount of chatter seemed able to shake. It was then that the strangest sounds began to emerge. At first I thought it was the creaking of old wood and the lapping of the tide against the hull. But soon, over the persistent whisper of the waves, I distinctly heard a low, mournful hum, an almost imperceptible chanting that seemed to emanate from all around us. The word "remember" drifted on that wind, layered beneath the hum, as if carried by the very breath of the sea. I watched in growing horror as my friends exchanged uneasy stares. Carter, ever the most introspective among us, murmured that the words stirred in him a profound sadness, as though it were a summons to acknowledge a debt of grief long overdue. Sleep that night was a fragment of elusive dreams and flickering shadows. I awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding erratically, to the unmistakable sound of dripping water, a slow, rhythmic beat that mimicked the chant. I could see the silhouettes of my friends in the faint light of the cabin below, their expressions troubled and distant. It was as if the cove had seeped into our souls. Whispers of "remember" echoed in my mind like a mantra, a refrain that demanded our acknowledgement of some ancient sorrow. Morning brought little relief. The fog had not lifted. Instead, it clung to the horizon like a shroud, reducing the world to penumbral outlines and soft, indistinct shapes. We decided to leave the cove immediately. Yet as we prepared the boat, an uneasy discovery halted our progress. A deep scratch carved into the hull of the Wanderer, running along its side like a jagged tear. The mark was fresh, its edges glistening with salt water and something darker, something that resembled dried blood. In that moment, the reality of our situation crystallized in a terror that was tangible. This was no random blemish. It was a warning, inscribed by whatever force haunted these waters. We set sail again, the boat's engine now labored and reluctant, its passage through the dark water laden with a palpable sense of dread. As we neared the open ocean, the haunting word receded for a time, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the sea. But in moments of stillness, I would catch a glimpse of something in the reflection of the water, a pale face, contorted and sorrowful, that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, but the memory persisted like a scar. Over the next few days, the tone of our voyage shifted from curious exploration to desperate unease. The usual banter was replaced by long silences and furtive glances. In the endless blue, every ripple and every shifting shadow on the water's surface carried the weight of a secret too terrible to name. At night, the stars offered little comfort. Instead of the usual tranquility, the heavens seemed overcast with an invisible gloom, and the dark sea whispered constantly some mournful refrain. I recall sitting on the deck in the heavy darkness, the cold wind piercing through our thin layers, and feeling an overwhelming sorrow as if I were a witness to an endless dirge of lost souls. One morning, as we continued our journey along the rugged New England coast, disaster struck in a way as unheralded as it was horrifying. We discovered that Carter was missing. One moment he had been laughing with us on the deck. The next, his spot was empty, his belongings scattered in disarray as if he had vanished into thin air. Panic set in as we frantically searched every corner of the boat and the nearby shoreline. The only clue was a single footprint in the damp sand near the cove we'd left, a footprint that seemed to lead directly into the churning, dark water. The realization was unbearable. The cove had taken one of us. In the ensuing chaos, blame and terror mingled, and the once carefree spirit of our expedition was replaced by bitter dread. We returned to the harbor in a daze, our boat laden with the weight of loss. Local authorities searched the area for days, but there was no sign of Carter or any explanation for his disappearance. The region's locals spoke in hushed tones of old legends, of a spirit that roamed the bleak coast, claiming those who dared disturb its sorrow. Some said that long ago, a terrible shipwreck had claimed many lives in these treacherous waters, and that the souls of the drowned had become cursed, doomed to whisper their laments into the darkness, seeking recognition from the living. In the aftermath, the experience continued to haunt us. Alex and Becky grew distant, their once vibrant personalities reduced to quiet, haunted glances and long silences. Diana, shaken to her core, left college soon after, unable to bear the constant reminder that something beyond human understanding had claimed one of our own. I, too, found that every reflective surface, every calm pond, every ripple on the ocean, became a dreaded portal to that cursed cove. At night, I would wake from fitful dreams, Carter's face emerging from the darkness with eyes full of desperate pleading and silent accusation, whispering a single word: remember. Over time, the tangible horror of that spring break gradually subsided into a torment of memory, an ever-present reminder of the inexplicable, the tragic, and the unearthly. I have tried to move on, to immerse myself in the mundane details of everyday life, yet I remain haunted by the relentless imagery of that cursed coast. In fleeting moments when the wind carries a certain salty tang or the water in a glass shimmers oddly, I feel the bleak presence of the cove, as if it were calling to me from a distant, forgotten part of my soul. Now, as I write these words with trembling hands in the quiet solitude of my apartment, far from the icy grip of that mysterious expanse, I wonder if the curse of the bleak coast is truly confined to that remote cove, or if it has, like a living memory, attached itself to each of us who dared to trespass into its domain. I search old photographs, reread fragments of local folklore, and even visit the harbor in hopes of finding closure, but every step only deepens the mystery. The sea is vast, its depths an endless repository of forgotten lives and unspeakable tragedies. And somewhere in that timeless darkness, Carter's lost voice seems to echo on every tide, a reminder that some tragedies refuse to fade, that the past clings to us with an unyielding grip, demanding that we never, ever forget. The Iron Graveyard. We never planned on our spring break trip taking such a sinister turn. What began as a carefree drive along endless highways through barren landscapes soon led us to a place whispered about in hushed tones by locals, a desolate ghost town known only as the Iron Graveyard. My friends and I, Colin, Marissa, Trevor, and I, had rented an old van with the intention of exploring hidden roadside attractions and reclaiming that flicker of wild freedom that college promises. None of us anticipated that we would soon be venturing into a realm where decaying metal and shattered memories conspired to haunt the living. Our journey started on a humid afternoon under a sky heavy with the threat of rain. The van's engine groaned along cracked asphalt routes that cut through stretches of nothingness, abandoned farms, rusted billboards, and the kind of eerie silence that makes you feel like you're trespassing on forgotten ground. After hours of driving, as twilight bled into night and the sun dipped below a horizon of rotting red, we found our way to a narrow road leading off the main route, a detour marked only by a faded sign reading, "Iron Graveyard 5 miles." With our curiosity aflame and our youthful arrogance in full swing, we took that turn. At first glance, the Iron Graveyard looked like a relic of industrial might gone to ruin. Once a bustling center of manufacturing during an era of promise, all that remained now were cavernous, rusted factories, skeletal structures of elevated rail lines, and endless piles of corroded metal. The town was abandoned decades ago after a mysterious collapse that left more questions than answers, and the few remnants of its industrial past were mutated into eerie monuments to time. The sight of towering metal frameworks, their surfaces mottled orange with rust and streaked by decay, filled me with a dread I couldn't explain, an instinctive warning that some places are best left forgotten. Before long, we parked near what used to be the main thoroughfare, now reduced to a memory of broken concrete and twisted rebar protruding from the ground, like the spines of some long-dead beast. The van's headlights illuminated a ghostly tableau: abandoned warehouses with gaping entrances, a dilapidated clock tower whose hands were frozen at an unknown hour, and stray pieces of machinery scattered haphazardly on cracked pavement. There was an unearthly silence here, disturbed only by the occasional groan of metal settling in the cold wind. The air carried the tang of iron and decay, heavy with a sense of loss and regret. We set out on foot, our flashlights cutting through the murk as we crossed over the threshold of the derelict town. Every step stirred up memories of the past, rustling leaves and bits of paper scuttling along the ground, as if trying to speak of what once had been. Our laughter and easy banter soon faded as we encountered sights that made our stomachs churn. In what appeared to have once been an assembly hall, we found rows of broken chairs and a huge iron bell hanging precariously from a tall frame. Its surface was etched with scratches and symbols that glowed faintly in the stray beams of our lights. I remember reaching out to touch the bell, half expecting it to toll on its own. But my fingers recoiled at the chill that ran through the metal, as if it had absorbed the sorrow of countless lost souls. We pressed deeper into the maze of abandoned factories, navigating corridors filled with debris and the constant echo of our footsteps. In one cavernous space, beneath a collapsed roof that allowed starlight to filter in, we discovered remnants of old signage. Words like hope, fortune, and progress, now warped and nearly illegible. Each broken letter told a tale of ambition and despair, a bitter irony that the very devices designed to forge a future had crumbled into nothingness. It was here that a faint metallic clanging caught our attention. At first we dismissed it as the sound of wind rattling loose metal, but as we moved closer it evolved into a low rhythmic pounding, a relentless echo that seemed synchronized with our own heartbeats. Over time, that droning sound began to reveal itself in disturbing ways. One night, while we camped in a cleared lot by one of the rusted factories, I awoke to find the excellent quiet of the desert replaced by an incessant clatter that seemed to emanate from beneath the ground. I stepped out of our makeshift shelter and stared into the darkness, heart pounding. In the weak light of a half moon, I saw something impossible, a pattern of movements among the broken machinery, as if long-abandoned industrial robots were reassembling themselves in slow, deliberate motions. The sight was brief, a flicker along the edge of vision, but it shattered my fragile sense of realism. I ran back to the others in a state of near panic, but they only exchanged uneasy glances, murmuring that perhaps exhaustion and the bleak surroundings were playing tricks on our minds. Yet something had been set in motion here, an undercurrent of malice hidden in the decay. As we explored further, we stumbled upon hints of personal tragedy amid the rubble. In a small courtyard that had once been the entrance to a factory complex, we discovered a rusted filing cabinet with fragments of documents strewn across the floor. Among the debris was a crumpled diary, its leather cover water-stained and its pages yellowed by time. I gingerly pried it open and skimmed through entries written in a hurried, trembling hand by someone who described horrifying accidents, mysterious disappearances of workers, and a palpable sense of dread that had gripped the town in its final days. One entry, in particular, sent chills down my spine. They come for the forgotten, as if the machinery itself seeks vengeance. We must remember, or we will join their ranks, lost and unrecognized. The phrase, "remember," recurred throughout the diary, a desperate refrain urging the living not to forget the souls sacrificed in the heart of industry's collapse. That word haunted me as we made our way out of the inner complexes. Every darkened corridor and every silent tower of rust seemed to carry the mournful echo of lost memories. At night, when we huddled around our small campfire in the open lot, the wind through the skeletal remains of the factories sounded like whispered voices, a broken chorus reciting that cursed demand. I found myself staring off into the distance, as if I could see the specters of the past drifting among the ruins, a procession of ghostly workers in stained overalls and weary eyes, marching in eternal lament toward a destiny of oblivion. Then came the night the true horror unfurled. We had decided to leave the iron graveyard at dawn, our resolve hardened by the suffocating melancholy and the weight of the diary's revelations. That evening, however, we chose to spend one last night venturing near the central ruins, drawn by a sense of obligation to witness the final vestiges of a forgotten world. As darkness deepened and the oppressive silence thickened, we set out with our flashlights and the diary clutched tightly in my hand. The wind was a cold, relentless force that swept through the narrow lanes between shattered buildings, carrying with it a low, desperate moan that I couldn't decipher. It was as if the very ground was crying out in sorrow. In the midst of our cautious exploration, we came upon a massive, corroded gate that led into a courtyard once used as a memorial for fallen workers. The ironwork was elaborate and ornate, but now it lay decaying and twisted, half buried in vines and dust. Beyond the gate, under the pall of a black, starless sky, was a sight that made us all stop in stunned silence. A giant, rusted plaque set into a crumbling wall, its surface covered in cryptic markings. The inscription was worn, but one phrase remained clear: "Remember those who lie beneath." In that moment, the air turned unbearably cold, and a profound sadness seeped into our veins. Each of us felt as if an invisible presence was urging us to bear witness, an unspoken demand that the lives and labors of those long dead not vanish into oblivion. Before we could process what we had just seen, a deep, resonant noise emanated from the ground itself. It began as a low rumble and rapidly escalated into an almost unbearable clamor, as if a great engine were starting up beneath the earth. The sound reverberated through the courtyard, shaking loose chunks of rusted metal and sending vibrations up our legs. In the midst of that chaotic clamor, I saw a shape coalesce near the base of the plaque, a vague, humanoid outline that seemed composed entirely of swirling, rust-stained mist. The figure moved with a purpose that defied physics, gliding forward slowly as if driven by the collective grief of all the souls that had once labored here. I froze, my heart pounding so fiercely that it threatened to burst from my chest. The apparition's face was obscured by shifting shadows, but I could make out the features of tired, sorrowful eyes and a mouth that seemed to be frozen in a silent scream. Then, in a voice that was simultaneously distant and unbearably near, the figure intoned a single echoing word: "Remember." Its tone was laden with anguish and command, a decree that shattered the stifling silence that had held sway for so long. In that instant, I felt a paralyzing chill surge through me, as if every lost life, every forgotten tragedy had erupted in one single moment of anguished clarity. The world around us seemed to distort, the boundaries between memory and reality blurring into a haze of sound, light, and unbearable sorrow. My friends and I could only stand there, mesmerized and horrified, as more shapes began to form from the unsettled air, each one bearing the same tortured expression, each one moving in silent, mournful procession. The scene was surreal, a ghostly parade of spectral workers, their forms indistinct yet undeniably human, drifting toward the remnants of the memorial as if drawn by an otherworldly summons. In that moment, the iron graveyard's curse was undeniable. The souls of those lost to the relentless march of industrial demise had returned to remind the living of their sacrifice, a reminder that no progress comes without a cost. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with terror and sorrow. In a delirious haze, I begged my friends to help me escape, to leave behind the nightmarish vision that had invaded our world. But even as we ran through the labyrinth of decaying factories and shattered concrete, the echo of that single anguished command, "Remember," followed us relentlessly, reverberating off cold metal and broken stone. It was as if the iron graveyard itself had etched that word into our very souls, a ceaseless refrain that would never allow us to forget the deep, unhealed wounds of the past. We finally emerged onto the main road in the early hours of dawn, our van speeding away as if it could outrun the curse. The landscape blurred past us, an endless expanse of barren land and fractured memories. None of us spoke for a long while afterward, each lost in our silent reflections of grief and terror. Days turned into weeks, and while our friends eventually moved on with their lives, that night in the iron graveyard remains a scar etched deep within me. I have tried to understand what happened that fateful evening, poring over the remnants of the diary and the cryptic messages left behind on rusted metal and broken glass. Local lore provides no solace, only whispers of an industrial tragedy that claimed hundreds of lives. a collapse of ambition and hope that buried its casualties beneath heaps of twisted iron. The curse of the iron graveyard, it seems, is not so much an active malice as it is an eternal state of unacknowledged sorrow, a mourning that refuses to fade into silence. Even now I live with nightmares of that night. In every reflective surface, a puddle after rain, a dark window in an empty building, I see the faint, sorrowful faces of those lost souls staring back at me, urging me, pleading with me to keep their memory alive. And as I sit in the quiet moments of my life, when the wind rustles through the trees or the distant hum of machinery echoes in my mind, I hear, above all else, that single, relentless command: remember. I write these words not to revel in my own terror, but to honor every forgotten life that perished in the relentless tide of purpose and industrial ambition. May their story serve as a grim reminder that progress is paid for in endless grief, and that the ghosts of the past are never truly exorcised. They remain, waiting in the shadows of our memory, urging us to remember. And in the silence of the night, as I close my eyes, I know that the iron graveyard still lives on, a testament to loss and a warning to those who dare to forget. The Forgotten Asylum. Spring break had always been synonymous with wild adventures and rebellious splurges, but none of us ever imagined that one impulsive detour would lead us into a nightmare from which none of us would emerge unchanged. My friends and I, Lucas, Jade, Eric, and myself, had been riding the wave of youthful spontaneity when we decided to take a side road during our cross-country trip. We'd heard half-whispered tales of a derelict asylum hidden amidst an overgrown forest deep in the backroads of northern Ohio. It was said to have been abandoned decades ago under mysterious circumstances, its halls echoing with stories of suffering, neglect, and dark experiments. The few locals who still remembered its name spoke of it with a mixture of awe and dread, warning that some secrets are best left undisturbed. Fueled by a heady cocktail of bravado and the desire to capture a legendary haunted location on video, we decided that our spring break needed this one unforgettable, terrifying detour. The drive to the asylum was both eerie and deceptively mundane. We navigated endless stretches of cracked asphalt bordered by dense woodlands that seemed to swallow the light. As dusk approached, the sky turned an oppressive, bruised purple, and a heavy mist began to roll in from nowhere. Lucas drove our aging sedan along a narrow, winding road, the headlights slicing through the gloom with feeble resolve. Every so often I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow among the trees or a flicker of light that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Yet, with each mile that brought us deeper into the unknown, excitement mingled with a mounting sense of foreboding. Eventually the road opened into a small clearing where, looming before us, was the derelict edifice we had come to find, the Forgotten Asylum. Its once grand facade now lay in ruin, a sprawling, decaying building with crumbling stone walls covered in ivy and long, broken windows that resembled gaping, unblinking eyes. The wrought iron gate, half collapsed and rusted with time, swung silently as if stirred by a ghostly hand. An unsettling chill clung to the air. We parked the car at the edge of the overgrown lot and stepped out into the cool, damp evening. The silence that greeted us was heavy and absolute, punctuated only by distant, indistinct sounds. A creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through barren trees, and sometimes what I swore was a muffled cry that could have been mistaken for a scream. At first glance, the asylum might have looked like any abandoned building, but as we approached, the details grew ever more disturbing. The front door, its wood swollen from years of neglect, hung ajar as though inviting us inside. Faded warning signs, their messages eroded by time and nature, still clung to the masonry. We hesitated for a moment, exchanging uncertain glances. Jade, ever the fearless soul in our group, took the first step. "Come on," she urged in a hushed tone. "If we don't see something here tonight, our spring break is going to be the most epic story ever." Even though dread knotted my stomach, I had the same thrill that comes from stepping beyond the threshold of the known into a realm of oblivion. Inside, the asylum was a mausoleum of memories. The corridors were long and narrow, the walls marred by peeling paint and cryptic stains in erratic patterns. My flashlight's beam danced along the faded, peeling wallpaper, briefly illuminating disturbing sketches that looked suspiciously like anguished faces pressed into the surface. The air was stale, thick with the smell of decay, antiseptic chemicals, and something far worse, an acrid odor that hinted at despair. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness as if the building itself were counting our trespasses. In one hall, the floor collapsed beneath a particularly rotted section, sending a shallow tremor rippling along the corridor. We shuddered collectively, a silent agreement passing between us that every creak and groan of the decaying structure was a warning. We soon reached what had once been the central ward. The large, open room had a vaulted ceiling, now partially collapsed, with broken stained glass windows that cast irregular, haunting patterns on the ground. In the center of the room, a rusted iron bed frame lay toppled. Its once pristine white sheets were now stained with dark blotches that I dreaded to imagine were once blood. The oppressive atmosphere was punctuated by the faint sound of dripping water echoing somewhere in the distance, a slow, relentless reminder of decay and time slipping away. We gathered in a small circle and, driven by equal parts curiosity and terror, began to record what we could on our phones. Every fallen piece of furniture, every splintered fragment of wall, seemed to whisper a story too tragic to be spoken aloud. Then, without any warning, a sudden, ear-splitting noise shattered the silence. It sounded like a door slamming shut far down a vacant corridor, its sound reverberating off the brick and stone with a resonance that made our hearts race. Eric, his face pale, stammered that he thought he'd heard footsteps, a soft, deliberate tap, 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 echoing in the far distance. We exchanged nervous looks. Probably just the wind, Lucas tried to reassure us, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Still, the sound persisted, growing louder or nearer with each passing second, until it was impossible to deny that something was moving through those forgotten halls. Compelled by a mix of dread and the insistence to document every moment, we decided to follow the sound. Our flashlights trembled in our hands as we crept down a dusty corridor lined with tarnished mirrors. In the dim glow, I caught a fleeting glimpse of movement, a pale, gaunt silhouette that darted just beyond the reach of the beam. It was as if the mirrors themselves hinted at another presence, a secret lingering behind our reflections. Suddenly, one of the mirrors cracked with a sharp splintering sound, and a cold gust of wind burst through the passage as if exhaling ages of pent-up sorrow. As we advanced, the walls around us seemed to speak in muted whispers, fragments of broken conversation, like desperate pleas carried on a forgotten dialect of pain. The oppressive silence gave way to the echo of voices that we couldn't quite discern. Sometimes they seemed to murmur, "Remember." Other times they simply wept in a tone that pierced through the clammy darkness of our fear. Jade's hand gripped mine tightly as we paused before a heavy door at the end of the corridor. It was marked with a faded number, 13, and bore deep scratches, as though violent protests had been etched into its surface. A sudden urge overcame us, a mix of terror and irresistible compulsion, and with shaky determination, we pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, its only light coming from a single cracked window high on one wall. Inside, scattered on the floor, lay remnants of old patient records, their pages yellowed and smeared with what we later guessed to be tears and blood. In the center of the floor was a crude chalk circle, inside which someone had drawn a symbol that resembled a twisted, anguished hand. For a moment, the room felt charged with an almost palpable grief, as if it were a sanctum where the tormented souls of the asylum gathered to mourn their fate. Amid that desolation, I heard it clearly, the softest, most mournful whisper, as if spoken directly behind my ear. "Remember." I spun around, pulse hammering in my ears, but the darkness swallowed any trace of another presence. My friend's eyes reflected a similar terror, and we instinctively pressed together, huddling in the center of the room. The whisper came again, faint and sorrowful, then grew louder, transforming into a chorus of voices, layered and intermingled, a sorrowful dirge of voices from long-forgotten lives. At that point, the recording on Eric's phone, which had been rolling ever since we first entered the corridor, crackled with static and then, inexplicably, played back a segment of our own conversation, but distorted and intercut with cries and whispers we had not uttered. It felt as though the walls themselves were recording our intrusion and replaying the agony of all who had suffered here. Panicked, we backed out of the room and fled down the corridor, our footsteps echoing in frantic disarray. The building seemed to shift and change behind us. Hallways stretched impossibly long, doors morphed into blank, unyielding walls. In the swirling darkness, I caught one last glimpse of that gaunt silhouette, standing motionless at the edge of my vision, its eyes hollow yet pleading. "Remember," it repeated, and the sound now resonated deep within me, as if it had taken root in the very fibers of my being. We burst out of the asylum into the cool night air, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we sprinted back to the van parked at the edge of the overgrown lot. In the distance, the asylum loomed like a decaying beast, its broken windows and sagging roof a silhouette of horror against the moonlit sky. None of us spoke during the drive away. Our silence was profound, laden with unasked questions and unspoken grief. The journey back was a blur of tearful glances and haunted silence, with the feeling that something inside the asylum, something ferocious and sad, had followed us out into the night. In the following days, the memory of that terrible evening clung to us like a shadow we could neither outrun nor dismiss. At school, in the mundane chatter of cafeteria table conversations and campus life, that echoing refrain, "Remember," would surface unexpectedly. I began to notice reflections that did not match my own face, and sometimes I would see fleeting images of a gaunt figure in the periphery of my vision. Jade, who had been so bold the night of the exploration, withdrew into herself, her laughter now replaced by silence and distant stares into nothingness. Lucas and Eric muttered about the asylum as if it were a curse brandished upon our souls, a place whose grief and horror had irreversibly imprinted itself on us. I tried to rationalize it all, convincing myself that the asylum was nothing more than an old building steeped in tragedy, and that our minds, fueled by fear and adrenaline, had manufactured the rest. But every night, as I lay in bed in my own small apartment, the memory would surge back, the faint sound of whispering, a ghostly hand reaching out from dark corridors, and that single chilling word repeated over and over with an indomitable insistence: "Remember." I later returned to the campus library and unearthed old local records and newspaper clippings about the asylum's final days. It was said that the institution had been overcrowded and understaffed, a place where patients were not treated but forgotten. Staff accounts spoke of unexplained vanishings, of patients who had been locked away in their cells, only to be found wandering the halls in states of delirium, murmuring about voices in the walls. One particularly harrowing article revealed that a fire had broken out one winter night, and in the ensuing panic, many had perished inside, their names and stories erased by bureaucratic indifference. The records noted, with grim finality, "May they be remembered." It struck me then that our night at the asylum had not resurrected specters purely from our imaginations. It had awakened the frozen anguish of countless lives left unacknowledged. Now, years have passed since that spring break, yet the impact of the forgotten asylum remains an indelible scar on my soul. I avoid lonely, dark corridors and the brittle silence of abandoned buildings, for I know that some memories, once conjured, are inescapable. In every flickering light, in every sudden chill on a warm night, I sense the presence of those tormented souls, forever bound to a place where the living dare not go. Their voices, lamenting in a chorus of endless sorrow, echo incessantly in my mind, urging me with an uncompromising command: remember. I share this account not for mere sensationalism, nor to glorify my own terror, but as a solemn tribute to every forgotten life that suffered in that decaying asylum. In remembering, perhaps we give voice to their lost stories and admit the terrible cost of neglect, a cost measured not solely in life and death, but in the profound evaporation of humanity and compassion. Yet even as I strive to honor them, a single thought haunts me relentlessly. What if remembering is a curse in itself? What if the act of remembrance binds us to their sorrow until we too become lost in the endless corridors of despair?